Hey there, wanderers. Tonight we're cracking open a story you've heard 100 times, and I bet you've been reading it upside down. Two people, two temptations, the same schemer whispering in both ears, two endings that could not be more opposite. One walked straight into the trap, the other flipped it inside out. Here's the wild part. One little snack in a garden cracked an entire world in half, and one flat-out no in a blazing desert started gluing it back together. By the final chapter, you'll read this enemy's playbook line for line, the same 3 moves he's run since day one, plus the one counter that shatters him every time. No theology degree required, I promise. But stick around for the twist nobody catches. Our villain struts in as the hunter, cocky and already counting his win. With zero clue, he's the one being hunted. It's the kind of ending you can never unsee. So before we dive in, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? All right, lights low, volume up. Let's roll. So let's begin where every worthwhile story begins, with the setting itself, because in this case, the 2 backdrops are doing far more heavy lifting than anyone tends to notice. We usually skate right past the scenery to get to the drama, which is a bit like fast-forwarding through the establishing shot of a film, and then wondering why the ending feels like it came out of nowhere. Slow down for a minute. Look at where each of these 2 encounters actually takes place, because the 2 locations are practically arguing with each other across the pages. The first stage is a garden, not a scruffy little vegetable patch with 3 tomato plants and a hopeful basil, but a full, lush, engineered paradise, the kind of place a modern landscape designer would weep over and then immediately quit their job for. The account in the opening chapters of Genesis keeps hammering one word into the reader like a workman driving in the same nail over and over. Good. The light is good, the land is good, the sea is good, the plants, the creatures, the rhythms of day and night, all of it gets stamped with the same verdict. And then, at the very peak of the whole project, comes a human being, shaped, the text says, out of the dust of the ground, which is a humbling origin story when you think about it, because it means the crown of creation started life as, essentially, damp dirt with ambition. There is no bloodline to brag about here, no noble ancestry, just soil and breath. The breath is the important part. Something is poured in from the outside, and the dirt sits up and becomes somebody. Then comes a detail that people love to argue about and, frankly, love to misread. The first human is on his own for a stretch, and this is the one and only thing in the entire good creation that God looks at and calls not good. Loneliness gets the thumbs down. So a partner is formed, not from more dust scraped up off the floor, which would have been the efficient option, but from the man's own side, from a rib. It is a strange and deliberate piece of design. She is not made from his head to rule over him, and not from his feet to be trampled by him, as an old line has it, but from the middle, from close to the heart, to stand beside him. The 2 of them share the place with God directly. This is the part that is almost impossible for a modern brain to picture, because we are so used to religion being a matter of buildings and schedules, and a being who is comfortably far away. Here, there is no distance to speak of. The relationship is casual in the best sense of the word, the way you are casual with someone you have known your whole life and never once had a reason to fear. At the center of this whole arrangement stand 2 trees, and this is where the tension quietly enters the room. One is the tree of life. The other is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a mouthful of a name that we are going to spend a good chunk of tonight unpacking, so hold on to it. Around those 2 trees, the entire operation runs on exactly one rule. 1. A single boundary in an infinite garden. Everything is permitted, the whole place is a buffet with the doors flung open, except for the fruit of that one particular tree. And I want you to sit with how astonishingly generous that arithmetic is, because if you have ever read the terms and conditions on a phone app, or tried to assemble a piece of flat-pack furniture using an instruction booklet apparently translated by a committee that had never met, you know that one rule is not a lot of rules. Most modern apartment leases have longer lists of restrictions about where you can hang a picture. The creator of everything sets up paradise and asks for a single act of restraint. Naturally, that is the one thing that ends up mattering. It is worth pausing on that word good for a second because we read it as a bland stamp of approval, the verbal equivalent of a shrug and a nod, and in the original it is doing something far richer. The Hebrew here, tav, carries the sense of something working exactly as it was meant to, fitting its purpose, humming along in tune. A good knife is one that cuts cleanly. A good day is one that unfolds the way a day is supposed to. So when the world keeps getting called good over and over, it is not receiving a polite compliment on its looks. It is being described as a machine in perfect running order, every gear meshing with every other gear, nothing straining, nothing grinding, nothing out of place. That is the state the humans were handed, free of charge, on their very first day of existence. Not a fixer-upper with potential, a finished masterpiece they got to move straight into without so much as unpacking a box. And the life inside that masterpiece had a texture we have almost no reference point for. There were no locked doors between the humans and their maker, no appointments to book, no sense of a distant authority checking in from a great and nervous height. The old image of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day is worth lingering on precisely because it is so gloriously unglamorous. Not thundering from a mountaintop, not booming out of a storm cloud, walking in the evening air, the way you might stroll with an old friend after a meal because the conversation simply is not finished yet, and neither of you is in any hurry to end it. That was the baseline. That was the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. And it is exactly the thing that would soon be lost, which is why it matters that we see plainly what was actually there to lose in the first place. Now hold that image, the warmth, the abundance, the shared life, the single gentle fence, and jump forward a very long time to the second stage, because the contrast is the whole point and it hits like a bucket of cold water. The second scene is a desert, and when the text says desert, it does not mean a picturesque stretch of golden dunes with a photogenic camel in the distance. It means wilderness in the harshest sense, a landscape of cracked rock, bleached stone, brutal daytime heat, and a cold that creeps in the moment the sun clocks out. There is no fruit here. There is nothing that could reasonably be called a meal. The desert was not exactly running a hospitality service, and if it were, the reviews would be unkind. Into this emptiness walks a man, and the timing could not be worse for him physically, because he has just spent 40 days without food. 40 days. Your average person starts making questionable decisions after skipping lunch, so we are dealing with a level of depletion that most of us will thankfully never experience. His body is running on fumes. His reserves are gone. Every biological alarm he has is screaming at him. And it is not only the hunger, though the hunger is real enough. Extended fasting does strange things to a person well beyond an empty stomach. The mind goes foggy and then, oddly, sharp in all the wrong directions. Small irritations swell into enormous ones. The body starts quietly negotiating, then bargaining, then openly pleading. Layer on top of that the isolation, because there is not another living soul out here. No friend passing a water skin, no crowd, no encouragement, no gentle distraction of company to take the edge off a hard hour. Just a man, the wind, the rocks, and the very long silence that a wilderness does so well. If you set out deliberately to design the ideal conditions under which to pressure test a human being, to find out what someone is truly made of once every prop and comfort has been peeled away, you would be hard-pressed to improve on this arrangement. No abundance to hide behind, no familiar routine to lean on, nothing left but the person and whatever they actually believe when belief is the only thing they have got left. That, precisely, is the setting he was walking into. And here is where the two pictures slam into each other, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In the garden, everything. In the desert, nothing. In the garden, a full table with a single item roped off. In the desert, empty ground, and a stomach that has forgotten what food feels like. In the garden, a person at peak strength, freshly made, without a single ache or worry, standing on home turf. In the desert, a person at the absolute floor of human endurance, alone, out on foreign ground where the whole environment is against him. One scene is a picture of comfort tested by plenty. The other is a picture of a soul tested by lack. On paper, the first person had every possible advantage and the second had none, which is going to become a very important and very inconvenient fact later on, so tuck it away. Most people, if they ever notice these two stories sitting near each other, treat them as completely separate files. Two unrelated episodes, one near the start of the book and one much further in, connected by nothing more than a shared appearance by the same troublemaker. And that reading feels reasonable. It also happens to miss the single most important thing in the frame, so let me drop it in now gently, because it is the hook the whole rest of this hangs from. Both of these scenes were set up by the same hand, not the villain's hand, the director's. Look at the garden again. Who put the tree there? Not the serpent, not some rival power sneaking a landmine into paradise while the gardener was distracted. God planted it. He placed the one forbidden tree right in the middle of the garden, in plain view, fully aware of what could happen there. This is not a case of a hazard that slipped past quality control. The risk was known, and the tree went in anyway, front and center, not tucked away in a locked shed behind the compost. That should stop you in your tracks a little. The one object capable of unraveling everything was installed on purpose, by the one person who had every ability to leave it out. Now look at the desert. Here's the line almost everyone reads too fast. Before a single word of temptation is spoken, before the enemy so much as clears his throat, the text tells us plainly that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. He did not stumble out there by accident. He was not ambushed on a routine walk. He was led deliberately into the exact arena where the confrontation was going to happen. The one who was about to be tested did not wander into the ring. He was escorted to it on purpose by heaven itself. Take a step back and notice how thoroughly that upends the story we assume we are reading. We come to a tale like this expecting a familiar shape, the shape of nearly every story we have ever been handed. There is a good side and a bad side. The bad side makes the first move, and the good side has to scramble to counter it. The villain drives the plot, and the hero reacts. That is the default setting of our imagination. That is what we brace for. But that is not what is happening on either of these stages. In both cases, before the antagonist so much as appears, the ground has already been chosen, the conditions have already been set, and the whole scene has already been carefully arranged by the very authority the villain imagines he is about to outmaneuver. He is not the author of this story, he only thinks he is. He shows up to both scenes fully convinced he is the one setting the terms, picking the moment, springing the clever surprise. He has, in reality, strolled onto a stage built by someone else, to play a supporting part in a drama whose ending was settled before he ever opened his mouth. We are not going to unpack how deep that particular rabbit hole goes just yet. But once it clicks into place, you stop reading these as stories about a cunning enemy and start reading them as stories about a director the enemy never once suspected was standing right behind him. Sit with what that means, and then let it go for now, because it is a seed, and seeds take time. In both places, the location was chosen, the conditions were arranged, and the stage was built by the same authority long before the antagonist ever showed up believing he was the one running the operation. We are going to come all the way back to that near the end, and when we do, it is going to rearrange how you see everything sitting in between. For now, just let it settle quietly in the back of your mind, because here is the takeaway from all this scene setting, and it is simple. These are not two different stories. They are one story, one contest, one arena, staged twice. The furniture changes, the weather changes, the century changes, the person in the middle changes, but the shape of the thing, the setup, the stakes, the designer behind the curtain, that stays exactly the same. Once you start watching it as a single drama performed on two very different sets, the whole thing snaps into a clarity that the split-screen reading can never give you. And at the heart of each staging stands a single human being, which is the other thing worth naming before we go any further. In the first scene, a person freshly made, brand new, standing in for all of us at the very beginning of everything. In the second, another person entirely, arriving on the scene much later, walking deliberately into the same kind of test on dramatically worse terms. Two contestants then, facing the same opponent, offered variations on the same deal, watched by the same audience of one. Everything from here forward is really the story of how those two responded and why their responses shot off in such wildly opposite directions from what looks, at first glance, like an identical starting line. Keep both of them in view as we go. The comparison between the two of them is where nearly all of the meaning is going to live. And now we come to the object at the dead center of the first stage, the one I told you to hold on to. Because almost everyone gets it wrong, and getting it wrong quietly poisons the way we read the entire rest of the story. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We hear that phrase and our modern minds immediately do the modern thing, which is to reach for the least interesting possible meaning. Knowledge, we think, must mean information. Facts, data, as if the fruit were some kind of ancient encyclopedia, and eating it was the equivalent of finally reading the manual you had been ignoring. As if the whole tragedy hinged on Adam and Eve suddenly learning some spicy trivia they were better off not knowing. That reading is tidy, and it is also almost entirely wrong, and the reason it is wrong lives in the original language. The Hebrew word underneath our English word knowledge is da'at, and da'at is not the cool, detached, clipboard sort of knowing that we mean when we say we know that water boils at a certain temperature. It is not knowledge as a stored fact in a file somewhere in your head. Da'at is knowledge by experience. It is the difference between knowing, in theory, that fire is hot because someone told you, and knowing that fire is hot because you just grabbed a pan handle you assumed had cooled down. It is lived, felt, participated in. It is the kind of knowing that changes you because you were in it, not merely informed about it. Same English word, completely different weight. And that difference is the whole ballgame. It is worth noticing where else this same word turns up in the Old Text, because that tells you almost everything about its flavor. Da'at is the word used for the deepest, most personal kind of knowing that can pass between two people, the intimate knowing of a lifelong bond, the sort you build with someone slowly, over years, not the sort you get from skimming their file. It is knowing as closeness, knowing as relationship, knowing something from the inside rather than about it from a safe distance. So when the tree gets attached to this particular word, the text is not warning about an information hazard, as if the danger were learning a fact too big for the human brain. It is describing a whole way of relating to good and evil. To have da'at of good and evil is not to have memorized a tidy list of rights and wrongs. It is to be personally, experientially tangled up in the entire business of deciding them, to be in it up to your neck rather than trusting someone wiser to carry that weight on your behalf. That distinction sounds like a fine linguistic detail. It is actually the difference between a whole world that works and a whole world that breaks. To feel why this matters, you have to grasp what the human experience was like before that tree ever came into play. And it is genuinely hard for us to imagine because we have never once lived it. Up to this point, the man and the woman knew exactly one category of reality. Good. That was the only flavor on the menu. Everything they had ever encountered had come to them pre-labeled by God as good, and they simply received it as such. They did not sit around debating the merits of the sunset or holding committee meetings to determine whether the river was acceptable. God made it, God called it good, and they took him at his word and enjoyed it. Their entire relationship to right and wrong, to value, to what was worth having and what was worth avoiding, ran through him. He was the source of the definitions, and they were on the receiving end. There is a small detail in the sequence that sharpens this even further. According to the account, the humans arrived near the very end of the whole process, after the light and the land and the seas and the swarming creatures were all already in place. And the very next thing that happens is a day set aside for rest. Turn that over for a second. The first full experience the humans ever had was not labor. It was rest inside a world that someone else had already finished building. They did not earn the garden, they did not construct it, negotiate for it, apply for it, or pass a qualifying test to unlock the doors. They opened their eyes inside a completed gift and were simply invited to enjoy the run of it. That is the posture the entire arrangement began in, and it is worth naming out loud because it cuts directly against every instinct we have been trained into. We assume we have to build our own worth, earn our own standing, manufacture our own goodness from raw materials, clocking in early and staying late to justify our place. The original design assumed the exact opposite. You begin already held, already provided for, already welcome, inside something finished. Everything that follows is really just a question of whether you keep living gratefully from that gift, or decide at some point that you would rather generate the whole thing yourself from scratch. That is the piece we keep missing. In the garden, the humans were recipients, not judges. They were not the ones deciding what counted as good. They did not have to be. And more to the point, they were never designed to be. Think about how much lighter that arrangement actually is once you get past the modern reflex that any limit on our judgment must be an insult. They never had to carry the crushing weight of figuring out, from scratch and on their own authority, what was truly good for them and what would quietly destroy them. That burden simply was not theirs. Someone infinitely wiser held it, and they got to live inside the results, the way a young child gets to enjoy a warm house and a full plate without once having to understand the mortgage, the wiring, or the logistics of grocery shopping. That child is not oppressed by not running the household. That child is free precisely because someone competent is. And there is a quiet clue in the fact that this forbidden tree was not the only tree standing at the center of the garden. Right beside it grew the tree of life, and the pairing is not mere decoration. The tree of life represented exactly what the whole arrangement was built upon: life received continuously as a gift, ongoing existence flowing in from the outside, from the source, requiring nothing more than staying close and taking it. That was always the intended design. Life is something handed to you again and again by someone who happens to have an endless supply of it and no reluctance about sharing. Set against that, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil offered the opposite posture entirely: life and value seized and self-managed rather than gratefully received. Two trees then standing side by side, representing two whole ways of being alive. One says stay near and keep receiving. The other says break off and start running the operation on your own account. And here's the small tragedy hiding in the geography of it. The humans already had unlimited, unrestricted access to the first tree, the good one, the free one, the one nobody had roped off. They reached instead for the one that promised them a promotion nobody had actually offered. So what was actually on offer at that tree? Not a fact, not a secret, not some hidden piece of the universe that God was selfishly keeping locked away out of spite, which, incidentally, is exactly how the sales pitch would eventually be framed, and we will get to that salesman soon enough. What was on offer was a role. To eat the fruit was to reach up and take, by force, the one job that had never belonged to them. It was to stop being a recipient of the definition of good and to become the author of it, to move from trusting the label to writing the label, to seize, without permission and without the qualifications, the right to personally decide what is good and what is evil, on their own terms, by their own authority. In other words, they went for the judge's seat. And this is the image I want to burn into your mind for the rest of the story, because it explains everything that follows. Picture a courtroom. There is a bench and a robe and a gavel and all the authority that comes with deciding what is right and what is wrong. That seat was occupied, and rightly so, by the only one qualified to sit in it. And two people who had been given the run of the entire building, every room, every comfort, every privilege but one, decided that being trusted residents of the house was not quite enough. They wanted the robe. They climbed up onto the bench that was never built for them, picked up a gavel far too heavy for their hands, and started banging it, declaring themselves the authority on good and evil. Self-appointed judges in a court they did not create, ruling on matters they could not possibly understand, having quietly fired the only one who could. You might reasonably stop here and ask why the option to do this was even on the table. If the whole move was such an obvious catastrophe waiting to happen, why leave the door unlocked at all? Why put the tree there in the first place? And the answer is bound up in the very nature of trust, because trust that cannot possibly be broken is not really trust at all. It is just wiring. A bond in which one party literally has no capacity to walk away is not a relationship. It is a mechanism. And you cannot love a mechanism, and a mechanism cannot love you back. For the closeness in that garden to mean anything, for the humans to genuinely choose to trust their maker rather than merely be structurally incapable of doing otherwise, the possibility of the other choice had to be real and reachable. The single tree, the single rule, was not a hidden trap laid to catch them out. It was the one open door that made everything else in the garden authentic instead of automatic. A room you are not permitted to leave is not a home, however beautifully it is furnished. It is a cell with good lighting. The door had to be there for the love to be love, which is a strange and slightly uncomfortable thing to sit with, and also, if you follow it far enough, a rather beautiful one. That, and not the mere act of chewing a piece of fruit, is the fall. Let me be as clear as I can, because this is the hinge everything turns on. It was never really about the fruit. The fruit was just the doorway. The tree did not have some magic toxin in it that corrupted the human race on contact, like a cursed artifact in an adventure movie. The catastrophe was not chemical, it was a decision. The tree did not start the fall, the choice did. Specifically, the choice to stop receiving good as a gift from God, and to start assigning it as a verdict of their own. The instant a human being decides that the definition of good is theirs to write, the relationship of trust that held everything together is finished, and everything downstream of that broken trust starts to crack. The tree was simply the place where that choice became possible. Take the tree away, and the possibility of that particular rebellion vanishes with it, which is, when you think about it, exactly why the tree had to be there for the whole thing to be a real relationship and not just a very pleasant zoo. This also quietly reframes what the whole problem even is, which is worth slowing down for. We tend to picture wrongdoing as a checklist of bad deeds, a running tally of rules broken, as if the core issue were misbehavior, and the obvious fix were simply better behavior, more effort, a firmer grip. But look closely at what actually went wrong at that tree. Nothing was stolen from a neighbor. No one was struck or cheated or harmed in the ordinary sense we would recognize. The very first fracture in the human story was not a nasty action at all. It was a reorientation, a turning away from receiving and toward seizing, a change in the direction the whole heart was facing. The behavior came afterward, as behavior always does, trailing along behind the heart like luggage. But the behavior was never the root of it. The root was a change of trust, a private decision about who gets to be the source. And that, oddly, is a rather hopeful thing to understand. Because if the real problem were only a list of bad actions, then the solution would be an endless, grinding, hopeless effort to keep the list spotless forever. But if the real problem is a direction the heart has turned, then the real solution is not a longer list of better behavior at all. It is a turning back around. Hold on to that thought as well, because the entire back half of this whole story is, in one sense, about precisely that turn, performed flawlessly by someone standing on far worse ground than the two who first turned away. And here is the part that turns this from ancient history into a mirror, because it is very easy to file this away as a strange old tale about magic fruit and talking snakes, the kind of thing that has nothing to do with your Tuesday. But strip away the garden setting and look at the actual mechanism of what happened, and you will find it is the exact anatomy of every temptation you have ever faced. Every single one. Underneath the endless variety of specific temptations, the flashy ones and the boring ones and the embarrassing ones, there is always the same quiet engine running, and it hums one sentence. I will decide for myself what is good for me. That is it. That is the whole thing. Not, I want this specific object, but the deeper move underneath it. I am the one who gets to rule on whether this is good, regardless of what I have been told, regardless of who might actually know better. It is the same climb onto the same bench, just in different clothing. You can hear it in almost anything once you know the tune. It is the voice that says, you are the final authority on what is right for your own life. Thank you very much, and no one else gets a vote. Not tradition, not wisdom, not the people who love you, and certainly not any inconvenient sense that some things might be true whether you like them or not. It sounds like freedom. It always sounds like freedom, which is the clever part. But strip it down, and it is the identical maneuver from the garden, the same reach for a robe that never fit, the same quiet firing of the only one actually qualified to judge. The scenery is updated, the engine is ancient. And here is the quiet joke buried inside the whole promotion, the fine print the sales pitch always conveniently leaves out. The judge's seat is exhausting. Being the final authority on good and evil sounds like the ultimate freedom right up until the moment you actually have to sit there and rule on everything, with no one above you to appeal to and no ground beneath you any firmer than your own shifting opinion on a given afternoon. Every choice becomes yours to justify from the ground up. Every value has to be personally manufactured and then personally defended against the next doubt. There is no rest anywhere in it because there is no longer anyone you can finally trust to have gotten it right, including, on the honest days, yourself. The person who insists on being their own Supreme Court slowly discovers that they have also volunteered to be their own anxious, sleepless, endlessly second-guessing clerk, working the night shift on cases that never close. What got advertised as liberation turns out to be a demanding, full-time job with terrible hours and absolutely no one to pass the hard files to. The recipients back in the garden had it lighter, far lighter, and they traded the whole gift away for the dubious privilege of never again getting to set the gavel down. Which raises the obvious question, the one we have to answer before we can go any further. and it is the thread that pulls us straight into what comes next. If the fall was fundamentally about listening to a pitch and switching sides, about taking the definition of good from one source and handing your loyalty to another, then we need to look hard at the source of that pitch. Someone was standing there making the offer. Someone framed the whole thing, chose the moment, and sold the lie. So before we can understand the choice itself, we have to understand the salesman. Where did this enemy come from? And far stranger and far more important, where on earth did he get the authority to make an offer like that in the first place? Because he did have authority. That is the uncomfortable part almost nobody stops to explain, and it is exactly where we are headed next. So let's chase that thread all the way down to the bottom, because the authority question is not some dusty footnote you can skip on your way to the good part. It is the hinge that a much later scene, out among the desert rocks, is quietly going to swing on. The enemy in these stories carries a title, and titles, if you actually stop and read them instead of nodding past them, have a habit of giving the whole game away. In the accounts that come further along in the story, the one doing the tempting gets handed a specific name. He is called the Prince of this world, not once as a slip of the tongue, and not by some careless narrator who did not think it through, but deliberately more than once in the Gospel of John. The Prince of this world. Sit with that phrase for a second, because we tend to hear the word prince and immediately picture raw, unlimited power, a crown, a throne, the full intimidating package. And that is not quite what the word is actually doing here. The Greek word sitting underneath our polite English prince is archon. And archon does not mean the top of the mountain. It means a ruler, certainly, but the specific kind of ruler who governs a territory on someone's behalf. A magistrate, a governor, a deputy, an official who holds genuine power over a genuine domain, but who answers to a higher desk somewhere else. The catch, and it is an enormous one, is that an archon almost never sits at the very summit of the chain of command. An archon rules in someone's name. He is a viceroy, not the king, a regional manager, not the founder of the company, a provincial governor running things day to day for an empire whose actual capital is a long way away. The word itself, before you have even asked a single question, is quietly confessing that this figure, whatever power he wields it as a borrowed thing, delegated authority exercised on behalf of another rather than ultimate ownership held in his own right, which raises the single most interesting question that, oddly, almost nobody bothers to ask. If he is a deputy, then a deputy of whom? And where, precisely, did a creature like this manage to get himself handed the keys to an entire planet? It helps to ground that in something concrete, because the ancient world ran on exactly this kind of arrangement, and everybody listening would have understood it in a heartbeat. A sprawling empire could not have its emperor personally standing in every corner of every far-flung province at once. So the emperor appointed governors, officials sent out to distant regions to rule in his place, collecting the taxes, keeping the order, and carrying the full weight of imperial authority right up until the moment they overstepped it. A governor in some remote outpost could act with genuinely intimidating power, and the locals obeyed him as though the emperor himself were speaking through his mouth. But nobody was ever under the illusion that the governor owned the empire. He was a placeholder for a power seated somewhere far grander than himself. That is the precise flavor of the word pinned to our enemy. A governor, a stand-in, someone wielding a real and frightening amount of authority over a real territory, every last ounce of it originally belonging to somebody else entirely. There are a few tidy answers people tend to grab for at this point, and they are all wrong, which turns out to be instructive. The first assumption is that he simply took it, that somewhere off the edge of the page there was a great cosmic war, and he stormed the earth and seized it by force, wrestling it out of the Creator's hands like the climax of a fantasy epic. But the text never once describes heaven losing a battle for the planet. Nobody kicked in the gates. There is no scene anywhere of the rightful owner being overpowered and dispossessed, which, given that we are talking about the being who spoke entire galaxies into existence with apparently no visible effort, would have been a fairly short and lopsided fight in any case. The second assumption is that he built his own domain from scratch, that he is some rival creator with his own private workshop, cheerfully turning out his own dark kingdom in the garage. But he cannot do that, and we are going to circle right back to exactly why he cannot, because it happens to be one of the most important rules in this whole story. The third assumption is that the entire prince of this world business is just poetic language, a bit of dramatic flair not to be taken as anything real or binding. But the story never treats it as a metaphor. It treats it as an actual standing, a real claim with real weight behind it. So if he did not seize it and he did not manufacture it, and it is not merely a colorful figure of speech, then there is exactly one option left on the table, and it is the strange one. The authority was handed to him, given, transferred cleanly and legally out of the possession of someone who genuinely had it to give. And that immediately shrinks the list of possible suspects down to almost nothing, because there was only one party in the entire arrangement holding the deed to the earth in the first place. Only one figure anywhere with the standing to sign that particular authority over to anybody at all. Not an angel, not some cosmic tribunal convened for the occasion. A human being. Go all the way back to the original setup before a single thing had gone wrong. When the world was first put in order, the human was not simply dropped into the middle of it as a lucky resident there to enjoy the scenery and mind his own business. He was installed with a job. The very first commission ever handed to humanity was authority over the earth itself, dominion over the whole living system, the animals, the land, the seas, the growing things, the entire operation. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. The human was, in plain terms, the appointed governor of the planet, the deputy placed in charge of running the estate on behalf of its owner. And notice the exact shape of that arrangement because everything hangs on it. The owner did not hand over ownership, he handed over stewardship. The human held the crown of the world in precisely the sense we just unpacked. Real authority, genuine responsibility, the run of the entire place, but held on behalf of another, exercised in the owner's name, never seized as personal property. The crown sat on a human head, but it was a borrowed crown, worn by a caretaker, not welded onto the skull of a self-made emperor. It helps to picture the ancient logic behind this, because the original readers would have caught something we tend to miss. In the old world, when a great king ruled a territory too vast to stand in personally, he would set up an image of himself out in the distant provinces, a statue, a marker, a representative standing in for his authority so that everyone in that region understood who was truly in charge even while the king himself was nowhere in sight. The human was that, placed in the world as the living image of the owner, the visible stand-in for an invisible authority, tending the estate and representing the one whose name was on the deed. It is a genuinely dignified role, the sort of thing that ought to make you sit up a little straighter and also, unfortunately, the sort of authority that can be handed to precisely the wrong person if the caretaker gets careless about who he is taking his orders from, which is exactly where the earlier moment at the tree stops being merely a private tragedy and becomes a full transfer of ownership. Because in this story, authority follows allegiance. That is the piece that makes the whole thing finally click into place. You serve, in the end, whoever you actually obey. The instant you start taking your instructions from a new master, you have, in practical terms, changed whose side you are standing on, and whatever office you happen to be holding tends to walk over to the new boss right along with you. As we already saw, the real substance of what went wrong in the garden was never the fruit itself, but the switch, the decision to take the definition of good from a fresh source and hand loyalty over to it. What we did not yet name back then was the consequence of that switch. When the human deputy chose to obey the serpent's word over the owner's word, he did not merely break a house rule and earn himself a scolding. He changed employers, he walked his loyalty, and with it the entire office of governor, straight across the floor and over to the very creature murmuring in his ear. The keys to the estate dropped in effect into the hands of the intruder, not through burglary, but through the freely made choice of the one person on earth legally holding them. If that principle still feels a little abstract, strip it right down to something you have almost certainly watched play out in ordinary life. Picture a trusted manager inside a company. Someone handed the keys, the accounts, the client lists, the authority to sign deals on the firm's behalf. Now picture that manager quietly deciding, one unremarkable afternoon, that he actually answers to a rival outfit instead. He does not simply resign and stroll out empty-handed. Everything that was entrusted to him, all the access and the authority and the assets bundled up with the office, tends to flow toward whoever he has secretly begun serving. The betrayal is not only that he switched sides, it is that the switch dragged the entire estate along with it. That is the exact mechanism at work back in the garden, except that the estate in question was not a company with a quarterly report. It was a world. Step back and look at the actual terms of the deal that got struck. Because on paper it is arguably the single worst trade in the entire recorded history of trades, and it makes every regrettable purchase you have ever talked yourself into look like the work of a shrewd investor. On one side of the exchange, dominion over an entire good world, a planet in flawless running order, held in trusted partnership with the one who made it. On the other side of the exchange, the raw experience of evil, the bitter and useless knowledge that nobody had ever actually needed, the one commodity in all of existence with precisely zero resale value. The human traded the deed to paradise for a single mouthful of something he would spend the rest of his days trying and failing to give back. If you have ever swapped something priceless for something worthless during a weak 5 minutes, you have a faint and distant echo of the arrangement, though the scale here is admittedly a touch grander than trading your lunch for the kid across the table because his sandwich looked marginally shinier. And here is the cruelest wrinkle in that whole exchange, the detail that quietly turns a bad deal into a genuine catastrophe. Some doors only open in one direction. There are things a person can take on that cannot then be handed back, experiences that, once they are inside you, stay inside you whether you would like them to or not. The human did not sample the knowledge of evil the way you might try a food you turn out to dislike and then simply push the plate away. It got in and it stayed in, and there was no returning it to the shelf and politely requesting a refund. That is what made the trade so ruinous rather than merely embarrassing. It was not just a poor purchase. It was an irreversible one, the kind you cannot walk back by changing your mind the next morning and pretending it never happened. The keys were handed across, the door swung shut behind them, and from the inside, all at once, there was no handle to be found. So the enemy became the prince of this world not by winning and not by building, but simply and quietly by receiving. He is not a usurper who battered down the door and wrestled the throne away. He is a beneficiary who was handed the keys by the rightful tenant and told, more or less, to make himself at home. And that distinction is not some dry legal technicality you can wave off. It changes the entire texture of everything that follows. It means his claim, as unpleasant as it is to admit, actually rests on something solid. He is holding stolen property, in a sense, but it was not he who stole it. It was signed over to him. He is squatting comfortably in a house whose legitimate resident personally invited him inside, handed him the paperwork, and then wandered off. This also quietly explains a nagging feeling that almost everyone carries around and rarely knows what to do with, the persistent sense that something about the world is subtly, stubbornly off. That for all its staggering beauty, the place seems to be running slightly against its own grain, mismanaged somehow, as though the wrong set of hands is on the controls. According to the picture we have been sketching, that instinct is not paranoia, and it is not moping. It is simply accurate. The estate really is being run for the moment by a squatter with no love for it, a caretaker who neither built the place nor wishes it well, holding a lease he came by through somebody else's catastrophic decision. Which sets up the one question the entire rest of this story exists to answer. If a human being handed the keys away, then it is going to take a human being to win them back. Hold that thought loosely for now. You may already have a quiet suspicion about who eventually walks onto the second stage to attempt exactly that. And this, at last, is why a moment much later out in that desert lands so much harder once you are carrying the backstory with you. When the enemy makes his pitch to the exhausted, depleted man among the rocks, part of what he lays on the table is the kingdoms of the world and all their glittering splendor, and he says something that ought to stop you cold if you are paying attention. He says, in effect, that all of this has been handed over to me and I give it to anyone I please. Luke chapter 4, verse 6. Now here is the detail that almost everyone sprints straight past without a second glance. The man he is talking to does not argue with the claim. He does not fire back that the enemy owns nothing, that the whole boast is a bluff, that these kingdoms were never his to hand out in the first place. He simply declines the offer firmly on entirely different grounds. And that silence is enormous because if the claim had been a hollow lie, correcting it would have been the easiest move available, a single sentence to deflate the whole thing. The claim goes unchallenged for one simple reason. At the legal level we have been carefully laying out, it is not false. The authority really was signed over. The enemy really does, for the time being, hold the lease. We are going to come back to what he does with that lease and what the man among the rocks does about it, but that is a story for a little further on. For now, just register that the boast was real. Which finally brings us back to that rule I promised we would return to. The reason the enemy is fundamentally unable to simply build his own kingdom from raw materials, and it is worth branding into your memory because it will quietly explain every single move he makes for the rest of this entire story. Evil does not create. It has no raw material of its own, no workshop, no capacity whatsoever to bring anything genuinely new into being. All it can do, the only trick in its entire repertoire, is take something that already exists, something that was originally made good, and bend it, twist it, warp it, and angle it until it points the wrong way. Every act of darkness in the whole catalog, without a single exception, is just some good thing wrenched out of its proper shape and turned back against itself. That is not a limitation the enemy cleverly chose for strategic reasons. It is simply what evil is at the root, a parasite living entirely off borrowed goodness, structurally incapable of an original idea. There is even something a little pathetic about it once you see it clearly. The great adversary, for all his cunning, cannot make so much as a single new thing. He can only vandalize what someone better already built. That parasitic quality carries one more consequence worth naming, and it is an oddly encouraging one. A power that cannot create anything of its own, that survives entirely by feeding off borrowed goodness, is a power that can never be genuinely stable or permanent. It is always living on somebody else's account. A counterfeit only works for as long as it can pass for the real thing, and it collapses the very instant the genuine article shows up and stands beside it. The enemy's whole grip on the world has this same borrowed provisional quality baked right into it. He rules, yes, and the lease is real, but it is a lease and not a deed, and leases, by their nature, run out. He is a tenant who has mistaken his temporary occupancy for outright ownership, striding through the halls as though the house were his by right, apparently forgetting that the actual owner still holds the original paperwork and possesses a very long memory. We are nowhere near that part of the story yet, but it is worth quietly carrying the knowledge from here on that a borrowed crown was never once going to stay on that particular head forever. And the moment you grasp that, you start spotting it absolutely everywhere. Take the appetite of the body, the honest hunger that keeps a living creature alive, a thoroughly good thing wired into us on purpose and for our benefit. Bend it just slightly off true, and it becomes a craving that runs the whole show and enslaves the one who feels it. Take the delight of the eyes, the built-in capacity to see something lovely and be drawn toward it, also good, also handed to us deliberately. Bend that a few degrees and it curdles into a grasping, restless envy that can never once be satisfied no matter how much it swallows. Take the deep and tender human wish to matter, to be someone, to be worth something, arguably the most delicate good of the whole set. Bend that and it swells into the towering pride that has to stand on everyone else in the room in order to feel tall. Notice the pattern. In every single case, the enemy invented precisely nothing. He took a good thing the owner had already made and simply nudged it a few degrees off center, which, it turns out, is all it ever actually takes. And this is not some random handful of examples I grabbed to fill the time. It is a map. Specifically, it is the exact map we are about to spend the next stretch of this journey walking straight through, one road at a time. Because a very long while after all of this, one of the people who stood closest to the whole story sat down and tried to boil the entire machinery of temptation down into the smallest possible number of moving parts, and he landed on 3. Only 3. He wrote that everything the fallen world runs on comes down to the craving of the flesh, the craving of the eyes, and the pride of life. First letter of John, chapter 2, verse 16. Peel off the old-fashioned phrasing, and those 3 land as something startlingly plain and modern. The desire to feel, the desire to have, the desire to be. Every pull you have ever felt toward the wrong thing slots neatly into one of those 3 boxes, and if you are honest, you can usually name which box before you have even finished reading the list. And notice, before we take another step, that not one of those 3 desires is a bad thing in itself. This matters enormously, and it is the direct payoff of the rule we just laid down about darkness only ever bending what was already good. The desire to feel, to have, to be, These are not defects that got bolted onto human nature by some manufacturing error. They are the engine of a fully alive person. A creature with no desire to feel anything at all would not be a saint. It would be a corpse. A person with no wish to have or to hold or to build would never plant a garden, raise a family, or make a single thing worth keeping. The hunger to be someone, to count for something, to matter, is the very drive underneath nearly every good work anyone has ever accomplished. Strip all three of them clean out of a person, and you do not end up with someone holy. You end up with a stone, which is precisely why these three make such perfect handles for an enemy to grab. He is not reaching for some rare, exotic flaw buried in a few unlucky people. He is reaching for the standard equipment installed in every last one of us, the good and necessary machinery of being human, and giving each piece of it the smallest possible twist. And here's what lifts those three categories above the level of a tidy sermon outline you would nod along to and then forget by lunch. They are not abstract labels somebody dreamed up to sound comprehensive. They map onto both of the encounters we have been examining with a precision that borders on unsettling. Point for point, move for move, as though the exact same three keys were being patiently tried on two very different locks. The same trio of pressures shows up in the garden and then shows up all over again in the desert, in the same sequence aimed at the same three soft spots in a human being. We are going to lay that mapping out slowly and carefully, one lever at a time, and once you have actually seen it, you are not going to be able to unsee it because you will start catching the identical three moves being run on you in traffic, in shop windows, and on your phone, roughly every 11 minutes for the rest of your natural life. There is a strange kind of relief hidden in that number, incidentally, in the fact that it is 3 and not 3,000. The sheer variety of temptations a person faces across a lifetime can feel genuinely overwhelming. An endless, shape-shifting parade of a million separate pulls, each one seeming custom-built and impossible to see coming. But if all of them, every last one, trace back to only 3 root moves, then the whole intimidating mess quietly becomes something you can actually learn to read. It is the difference between a doctor drowning in 1,000 unrelated symptoms and a doctor who understands that nearly every fever traces back to a short, manageable list of causes. 3 is a number you can hold in your head without effort. 3 is a number you can watch for. The enemy would strongly prefer you believe his repertoire is infinite and unknowable, because a threat you cannot name is a threat you can never quite brace against. He has, in plain fact, only ever held 3 cards, and he has been playing them in slow rotation since the very beginning. There is also a logic to the order in which the 3 tend to arrive, worth flagging now so you can watch for it as we go. They generally run from the most obvious down to the most hidden, from the crudest pull to the subtlest. The appetite of the body is the loudest and the easiest to spot. The pressure a hungry stomach or an exhausted frame puts on you, right out in the open where anyone can feel it coming. The craving of the eyes sits a step quieter and a step further in, working through what you see and want rather than what you physically need. And the assault aimed at who you actually are is quietest of all, buried the deepest, the hardest to catch in the act, precisely because it rarely feels like a temptation at all. It feels instead like an honest question about your own worth. An attacker who knows his craft tends to open with the loud, simple pull and save the deep, subtle one for the moment your guard has already dropped. Keep half an eye on that escalation. But before we take the 3 apart one at a time, there is something crucial you have to understand about the one working the levers, or the whole thing is going to look like a run of dumb luck instead of what it actually is, which is design. This enemy is not impulsive. He is not a snarling brute lunging at whatever happens to wander closest. When he first slips into the garden, the text pauses just for a beat to describe him with one very particular word, and that word is crafty, shrewd, more cunning than any other creature out in the whole field. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. That is not throwaway scenery. It is a warning label pasted onto the character the moment he walks on. This is a planner, a strategist, something that studies, waits, calculates, and moves only once the conditions have lined up exactly the way it wants them. He does not improvise and hope for the best. He watches and he chooses. You can see that same patient, cold calculation stamped all over how he handled the second encounter out in the wilderness. He did not amble up on the very first day while his target was fresh, rested, and running at full strength. He waited. He let those 40 days do their slow, grinding work first, holding off until the body had dropped to its absolute lowest possible ebb, running on genuinely nothing, and only then did he make his move. He also, as we noted earlier, arranged for the confrontation to unfold on the emptiest, loneliest, most isolating ground on offer, rather than anywhere with a scrap of comfort or a friendly face nearby. That is not the behavior of an opportunist snatching at a lucky opening. That is a seasoned professional selecting both the moment and the terrain with careful, deliberate, unhurried intent. He picked the hour of maximum weakness on purpose, the way a chess player picks a move. And that ought to land somewhere slightly uncomfortable because you have to stop and think about who he was doing all this careful planning to. If he brought that much strategy, that much patience, that much precise timing to bear against the single strongest possible target in the entire story, he is not going to suddenly turn lazy and careless with an ordinary person on an ordinary Tuesday. If anything, the opposite. The care he takes scales up to match the stakes, but the underlying method never once softens or gets sloppy. Whatever strange pressure you have felt in your own weakest, most drained, most isolated hours, the timing of it was very probably not the coincidence it appeared to be. He has a marked preference for knocking when the house is emptiest. That is not meant to unsettle you for its own sake. It is meant to make you take the strategist seriously, which happens to be the first and most necessary step toward not getting quietly outmaneuvered by him. There is one further thing worth saying about this patience of his, and it is that the strategy tends to be personal. He does not run one generic script and blast it at everybody identically, the way a lazy salesman reads the same lines off a card no matter who happens to be standing in front of him. A skilled con artist studies the individual mark first, learns which particular door has been left unlocked, which specific weakness is worth leaning on, and only then tailors the whole approach to that one person. The 3 levers themselves are universal, the same 3 for everyone alive, but which lever gets pulled hardest, and when, and with what exact wording, tends to be fitted rather precisely to the individual. Some people are barely troubled by one of the 3 and desperately vulnerable to another. He notices that. He keeps notes, so to speak, and updates them. Which means the version of an old lie that finally slips past your guard is very often the version that has been quietly measured and cut to your exact size. So here's the shape of the road directly ahead, so you can see where we are going before we set off. We are going to take those 3 levers, the feel, the have, and the be, and pull each one apart entirely on its own, one at a time, watching in close detail exactly how it got worked in the garden, and then exactly how the very same lever got worked all over again in the desert. And tucked away inside those 3, there is a detail, a small recurring thing that is genuinely easy to miss on the first pass, which is going to matter enormously later on when we finally arrive at the single factor that actually decided how each of these 2 stories ended. I am deliberately not going to point straight at it yet because half the pleasure is watching it quietly assemble itself in front of you. Just keep one corner of your attention propped open for it as we walk. And do not underestimate how much of the whole battle is won simply by being able to name which lever is being pulled in a given moment. There is a peculiar power tucked inside that small act. A vague, nameless pull is almost impossible to resist. Because you cannot fight a fog, you can only be slowly swallowed by it. But the instant you can look squarely at the pressure you are feeling and quietly label it, this is the have lever. This is only the old craving of the eyes wearing today's outfit. Something shifts and slackens. The pull loses a surprising amount of its grip the moment it is correctly named, in much the way a menacing shadow on the wall stops being frightening the second you identify the perfectly ordinary object casting it. This is also, as it happens, why those same 3 drives quietly power almost the entire advertising economy. Nearly every message competing for your attention out there is aimed with real precision at exactly one of the 3, promising you a feeling, an acquisition, or a shinier version of yourself, and usually for a strictly limited time only. Learn to spot the 3, and a startling amount of the noise of modern life abruptly resolves into a pattern you can see straight through. For right now, hold the simple version, the 3-point map you can fold up and carry in your pocket through the rest of all this. Everything the enemy has ever attempted on anyone in any century, on the strongest saint or the most ordinary soul, comes down in the end to one of 3 angles of attack. He goes after what you want to feel. He goes after what you want to have. He goes after what you want to be. The body, the eyes, the self. 3 levers endlessly reshuffled and recombined, dressed up in 10,000 different costumes so you rarely notice they are the same 3 underneath, but underneath they are always only those 3. Keep that trio firmly in hand, because from this point forward we are going to watch a genuine masterwork, all 3 of them in turn. First on someone who started with every conceivable advantage and folded anyway, and then on someone who started with nothing at all and somehow did not. So we begin, as the enemy himself tends to begin, with the loudest and most obvious of the 3, the lever bolted directly to the body. It is the crudest tool in the kit, and also, for that very reason, the one that works most reliably, because the body is not a subtle negotiator. It does not send a politely worded memo requesting your attention at your earliest convenience. When it wants something, it simply starts making noise, and it keeps making noise, and it has never once in the entire history of the species been talked out of anything by a well-reasoned argument. This is the pressure point the enemy reaches for first on both of our contestants, and watching him work the same lever on 2 people in such wildly different conditions is where the whole thing starts to get genuinely interesting. Look at the 2 moments side by side. In the garden, the woman looks at the forbidden tree and registers, first of all, that it is good for food. That is the opening detail, the very first thing noted about the pull she feels. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. The fruit appeals to the stomach before it appeals to anything else. And out in the wilderness, the very first words the enemy brings to the starving man among the rocks are an invitation to turn the stones scattered around him into bread. Matthew chapter 4, verse 3. 2 completely different props, a piece of fruit and a pile of desert rock, but underneath them the identical move, executed with the same cold precision. Feed the body, give the flesh the thing it is currently demanding. Satisfy the appetite that is talking loudest right now. And it is worth pausing to say clearly, because it is the sort of thing that gets muddled, that there is nothing whatsoever wrong with the appetite in question. Hunger is not a defect. Bread is not a sin. Eating is one of the more reliably good things a creature can do with an afternoon. As we already established, the enemy has no capacity to invent a new evil. So what he does here is exactly what he always does. He takes a thoroughly good and necessary drive and gives it the smallest possible twist. The lever is never the hunger itself. The lever is the question of who you are going to trust to decide when and how and on whose terms that hunger gets answered. Keep your eye on that, because it is the whole game, and it is easy to lose in the noise of a growling stomach. Part of what makes this first lever so effective is that the body has almost no sense of time. It lives entirely in the present tense, with no real memory of yesterday and no working belief in tomorrow. It cannot be reasoned with by pointing out that the craving will pass in 20 minutes, because as far as the body is concerned, there is no 20 minutes from now. There is only the roaring, absolute now. This is exactly why hunger, exhaustion, and physical discomfort are such dependable tools. They collapse your whole horizon down to the immediate instant and make the long view feel abstract and faintly unreal. Everything you actually care about, every commitment, every larger loyalty, suddenly seems distant and theoretical, next to the very concrete fact that you want the thing in front of you and you want it right now. The enemy is not really arguing with your values when he pulls this lever. He is simply shrinking your field of vision down to a single point until your values cannot get a word in edgewise. Whoever controls the size of your horizon controls a surprising amount of what you will do next. There is a related sleight of hand riding along with this, which is the body's habit of inflating a mere want into what feels like a full-blown emergency. The appetite rarely announces itself honestly as a preference. It shows up disguised as a necessity, insisting that you do not merely want the thing, you need it, and that something unbearable will happen if the craving goes unanswered. Most of the time, this is simply not true. The overwhelming majority of things the body frames as desperate needs are, on cool inspection, perfectly ordinary wants wearing an urgent costume. But in the heat of the moment, the costume is convincing, and a want that has successfully dressed itself up as a need feels nearly impossible to refuse, because refusing a genuine need looks like self-harm rather than self-control. Learning to quietly ask whether a given pull is actually a need or just a want, in a very good disguise, is one of the more useful skills a person can pick up, and, unsurprisingly, one the enemy would very much prefer you never developed. Now here's the contrast that ought to genuinely stop you because it turns everything you would assume about this on its head. Think carefully about the physical state of each person at the moment the lever gets pulled. The woman in the garden was, in all likelihood, not even hungry. She was standing in the middle of a paradise absolutely stuffed with fruit of every conceivable kind, an all-you-can-eat arrangement with essentially one item on the entire menu roped off. She did not reach for the forbidden thing because her body was in any distress. She reached for it from a position of total abundance, with a full stomach and unlimited options, and wanted the one thing she had been asked to leave alone. The man in the desert, by contrast, was at the absolute end of his physical rope, 40 days into a fast, running on genuinely nothing, his body sending up every alarm it had. One person had everything and grasped for more. The other person had nothing and said no. Sit with how backward that is compared to what you would expect. Because the lesson buried in that reversal is one almost nobody wants to hear, which is that fullness is frequently more dangerous than emptiness. We tend to assume temptation is at its strongest when we are deprived, that lack is the great enemy of the will, and that if we could just get comfortable enough, secure enough, well-fed enough, the pull toward the wrong thing would quietly fade. The garden says otherwise. It says that a person surrounded by every good thing, wanting for nothing, perfectly provided for, can still turn and reach for the single thing not on offer, precisely because comfort has a way of dulling the very alertness that keeps a person standing. Abundance lowers your guard. It whispers that you have earned a little something extra, that the rules are for people in worse situations than yours, that surely one small exception could not possibly matter when everything else is going so well. The desert oddly sharpens a person, while the garden softens them, and softness, it turns out, is exactly the condition in which people quietly hand away the things that matter most. And there is a strategic reason this particular lever comes first in the sequence rather than somewhere in the middle. A worn-down body is not merely a target in its own right, it is a doorway into the other two. When a person is exhausted, depleted, physically frayed, every other defense they have quietly weakens right along with it. Judgment goes cloudy, patience thins out to nothing. The capacity to resist the subtler pulls, the ones aimed at the eyes and at the sense of self, drops off sharply the moment the body is running on empty. This is not some spiritual mystery, it is something anyone who has ever been genuinely tired and hungry at the same time already knows in their bones, usually from an argument they deeply regret. You become a worse version of yourself, more brittle, more impulsive, far more willing to reach for the easy and the immediate. So the enemy opens with the body not only because it is the loudest lever, but because softening it first makes every move that follows cheaper and easier. Break down the physical, and the mental and the spiritual are suddenly far simpler to breach. It is, in the end, a siege tactic. Wear down the walls first, then walk in through the gap. There was also something more specific tucked inside the desert version of the lever, worth drawing out, because it was not merely an invitation to eat, it was an invitation to solve a real and legitimate need by stepping outside of trust and supplying himself, on his own authority, on his own timetable. The suggestion was not evil on its face. The man could, in fact, have done it. The problem was that doing so would have meant taking his cue from the wrong voice, meeting a genuine hunger by pulling rank, rather than by continuing to rely on the one who had led him out there in the first place. It was the offer to become, in that small moment, his own provider, his own source, the one who decides that the need in front of him justifies stepping off the path, and a need really was there. That is what made it clever. Nobody gets tempted by an obviously stupid offer. They get tempted by a reasonable-sounding solution to a genuine problem, delivered at the exact moment they are least equipped to think it through. The reply he gave is the part worth memorizing because it reframes the whole thing rather than just resisting it. He answered that a person does not stay alive on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God, drawn, as it happens, from an old line in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And notice what that answer is actually doing. It is not a rejection of bread, as if food were somehow beneath a spiritual person, which would be its own kind of nonsense. It is a matter of ranking. Bread is real, bread is good, bread genuinely keeps you alive, but it is not the deepest thing keeping you alive. And the moment you treat it as the ultimate thing, the thing worth stepping off the path for, you have quietly made a small idol out of your own stomach. The answer puts the body back in its proper and honored place, important but not sovereign, a servant rather than a master. The hunger was never the failure. Elevating the hunger to the throne would have been. There is one more thing to flag about where that answer came from, and then we will let it sit, because it is going to matter enormously later on. The line he reached for was not a spontaneous invention. It was a quotation, pulled from a specific and rather significant place in the older story, a place involving a long stretch of time, a wilderness of its own, and a whole people learning this exact lesson about bread the hard way. We are not going to unpack that connection yet, but file away the small detail that his defense, in the moment of maximum physical weakness, was to remember something. The source of that memory is a thread we will pick back up. And before we leave the body behind, it is worth being honest about how relentlessly this same lever gets worked on ordinary people. Because it is easy to imagine this is all ancient and exotic and has nothing to do with your evening. It has everything to do with your evening. We live in a civilization that has, with tremendous effort and considerable ingenuity, engineered away almost every gap between wanting a thing and having it. We have built entire industries on the founding principle that no human being should ever be asked to wait more than a few seconds, or tolerate the smallest discomfort, or sit with an unmet craving for longer than it takes to tap a screen. The body wants comfort now, satisfaction now, relief now, and an enormous machine stands ready to whisper that of course you deserve it, of course you have earned it, of course now is the right time. The lever has not changed one bit since the garden. It has simply been fitted with faster delivery. And the quiet failure it is fishing for is always the same, not the fact that the body has needs, which is fine and good and human, but the decision to let the loudest, most immediate need in the room become the thing that decides your steps. The question the first lever is really asking, underneath the fruit and the bread and the 2-day shipping, is a question about trust. Who gets to decide how your hunger is answered? That, and not the hunger itself, is where it is always won or lost, which brings us up one rung to the second lever, quieter than the first and a good deal sneakier for it. If the body pulls at you through raw need, this one pulls at you through the eyes, through what you see and having seen decide you must have. It works not on the stomach but on the gaze, and it is subtle precisely because it rarely feels like an appetite at all. It feels deceptively like appreciation, like taste, like simply noticing how good a thing would be to possess. Part of why this second lever slips past our defenses so easily is the peculiar speed of sight itself. Seeing is nearly instantaneous, and wanting tends to follow it so closely that the two can feel like a single event. You do not deliberate your way into desiring something you have laid eyes on, the way you might reason your way toward a careful conclusion. The wanting arrives fully formed in the very same instant as the seeing, long before the slower and more sensible parts of the mind have had any chance to weigh in. By the time reflection finally shows up to ask whether this is actually a good idea, desire has already moved in, unpacked its bags, and begun rearranging the furniture to its liking. That is precisely what makes the eyes such an effective point of entry. They bypass the argument altogether. There is no debate to win because the pull is not making an argument in the first place. It is simply presenting an image and letting the image do all the quiet work. And an image, unlike a spoken claim, cannot really be fact-checked in the moment. It just sits there being beautiful, which turns out to be a remarkably persuasive thing for anything to do. Trace it through both scenes the same way. Back in the garden, right alongside the note that the fruit was good for food, comes a second observation, that it was a delight to look at, pleasant to the eyes, visually appealing in a way that drew the gaze and would not let it go. And out in the wilderness, the enemy takes the man up to a high vantage point and shows him, in a single sweeping panorama, all the kingdoms of the world, and the full blazing glory of them. Matthew chapter 4, verse 8, with Luke adding that it happened in an instant, the whole dazzling display laid out at once. Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Now the scale here could hardly be more different. On one side, a single piece of fruit hanging on a branch. On the other, every empire and city and civilization on the face of the earth, spread out in one glittering sweep. But do not let the difference in scale distract you from the sameness of the method, because it is the identical move. Something beautiful is placed in front of the eyes, and the beauty itself becomes the argument. It is lovely. Look how lovely it is. Surely something this good to look at is meant to be yours. That enormous gap in scale, incidentally, is worth a moment all on its own because it quietly tells you something about how the enemy operates. The size of the bait always gets matched to the size of the target. A single piece of fruit was enough to move the first pair because a single piece of fruit was proportionate to who and where they were. But you do not offer one piece of fruit to the one figure in the entire story actually capable of reshaping everything. For a target like that, the bait has to be correspondingly vast. And so out come all the kingdoms of the world at once in one blinding, sweeping display. The principle underneath is oddly flattering and deeply unsettling at the same moment. The enemy calibrates the offer to the person standing in front of him. A small soul can be caught with a small shiny thing and grabs it and never notices the hook. A great one requires a genuinely enormous temptation, which is exactly why the strongest people so often face the largest and most terrible versions of the lie rather than being spared them. If the temptation in front of you ever feels absurdly, disproportionately large, that is not necessarily proof that you are weak. It may be a rather backhanded compliment about precisely how much is thought to be at stake in you. And here is where you have to dig a layer deeper, because underneath the beauty, every single time, there is a second offer hidden inside the first, and it is the real one. Beneath the visual appeal lies the promise of a shortcut. The beautiful thing is never simply being admired, it is being dangled as a way to skip something, to get to a destination without traveling the road that leads there. That is the actual product on sale, and the beauty is just the wrapping. Look at both pitches with that in mind, and they snap into focus. In the garden, the promise attached to the fruit was that the humans would become like God, and the unspoken clause underneath was, and you can have it right now, this instant, by simply reaching out and taking, no waiting, no growing, no long, slow process of becoming. Skip the road. Out in the desert, the promise attached to the kingdoms was direct rulership over all the nations of the earth. And the unspoken clause underneath was, and you can have every last one of them without walking the hard and terrible road that was otherwise going to get you there. Skip the cost. Same offer, wildly different scale. Have the end without the means. Reach the summit without the climb. It is worth noticing, too, exactly what got put on display up on that height because the account is careful about it. The man was not shown merely the kingdoms of the world. He was shown the kingdoms and their glory, the shine, the splendor, the sheer dazzling magnificence draped over them. And that extra word is doing quiet work because very often the glory is the real hook rather than the raw power underneath it. Plenty of people do not actually want the grinding, thankless labor of ruling anything. What they want is the glow that surrounds it, the splendor, the sense of standing at the bright center of everything while the light bounces off them. The enemy understands this perfectly. He rarely bothers trying to sell the responsibility, which is heavy and dull. He sells the shine. The kingdoms themselves were almost incidental to the pitch. It was the glory poured over the top of them, the spectacle of it, that was engineered to catch the eye and hold it. And a craving for that kind of shine, unlike a craving for a loaf of bread, can never actually be filled, no matter how much of it you manage to gather, which is exactly what makes it such durable and profitable bait. And beneath both of those, older than either, sits the single most seductive lie ever whispered to a human being, the promise that you can have the crown without the thorns, the glory without the cost, the reward without the long, unglamorous, often painful process that reward is supposed to grow out of. It is the most attractive offer in the world because it targets something perfectly reasonable. Nobody actually enjoys the hard road. Nobody wakes up hoping for more struggle. So an offer that promises the prize while quietly deleting the price will always, always find a willing ear. You can see the very same lie running our own world at full volume incidentally in 1,000 cheerful disguises. The entire self-improvement aisle rests on the suggestion that you can have the results without the reps. Whole fortunes are built on the promise of getting rich without the tedious business of building anything. There is, apparently, always one weird trick, some clever bypass around the effort everyone before you had to actually put in. The lever is identical to the one in the garden. It has just been given a marketing budget. This second lever has found an especially cozy home in the modern world, and not only in the loud, obvious form of advertising. Its subtler and far more constant expression is comparison. We now spend a genuinely remarkable share of our waking hours looking at carefully arranged glimpses of other people's lives, the highlight reels, the curated fragments, the single best moment plucked out of 1,000 ordinary ones and lit beautifully. And the eyes do with these exactly what they did with the fruit hanging on the branch. They see, and having seen, they want. The particular cruelty of the arrangement is that you are almost never comparing your real life to somebody else's real life. You are comparing the messy, unedited, behind-the-scenes footage of your own existence to the polished, framed, best-angle version of theirs. It is a rigged contest, and you will lose it every single time, by design. The pull it generates is the same ancient craving of the eyes wearing a fresh outfit. The restless, nagging conviction that the good and the beautiful and the enviable thing is always located somewhere other than exactly where you are standing. It is the identical lever from the garden. It has simply been handed a camera and a very large audience. But here's the thing the shortcut never mentions, the reason it is a trap rather than a bargain, and it is worth understanding deeply. The road to a thing is very often part of the thing itself. The climb is not a pointless obstacle bolted onto the front of the summit to annoy you. The climb is what turns you into the kind of person who can actually stand on the summit without falling off the other side. Skip the road and you do not arrive at the destination early. You arrive as the wrong person, unequipped, unformed, holding a prize you have no capacity to carry. A crown handed to someone who never walked the road that shapes a king is not a gift. It is a weight that will crush them. The shortcut does not get you the good thing faster. It gets you a hollow imitation of the good thing and strips out precisely the part that would have made it worth having. That is why the beautiful offer is always underneath a swindle. It promises to save you the very journey that was the whole point. There's a second reason the shortcut had to be refused, quieter than the first but every bit as important, and it turns entirely on the difference between a thing grabbed and a thing given. As we saw much earlier, the original disaster was fundamentally a reach, a grasping for something that was meant to be received rather than seized. And the shortcut up on the mountain was offered in precisely that same grasping mode. Take it, snatch it, reach out your hand, and it is yours. But here's the detail that makes the whole offer almost comical once you actually see it. The kingdoms of the world were already, by the long road, going to be his. That was the destination the entire journey had been pointed toward from the start. The enemy was not offering him something he could otherwise never have. He was offering him his own inheritance, at a price that would have cost him everything he was, tempting him to grab in a single instant what he was already on his way to receive rightfully in the end. It is a little like being handed a stolen copy of the keys to a house you happen to be the sole heir of. The offer only works at all if you have somehow forgotten that the house was coming to you anyway by a better road with clean hands and a clear title. And it is worth sitting for a moment with how that refusal must have looked from the outside, because from the outside it looked exactly like losing. Picture the scene honestly and without the halo. A man turns down ownership of the entire world and is left standing precisely where he was, out among the rocks, still hungry, still unknown, still holding nothing but a fistful of desert dust. From any ordinary vantage point, that is not a triumph. It is a spectacular missed opportunity, the kind of thing you would replay at 3 a.m. for the rest of your life, wincing. This is the part of resisting the shortcut that nobody puts in the brochure. In the actual moment, refusing the bypass almost never feels like strength or wisdom. It feels like standing on the shoulder of the road watching everyone else speed past you on the fast lane while you set off on foot, quietly wondering whether you are simply a fool. The reward for the long road is real, but it is nearly always deferred, paid out much later and well out of sight, while the cost of it is charged immediately and in full, which is exactly why so few people take it. The shortcut pays now and bills you later. The long road bills you now and pays later, and most people, understandably, cannot bear the weight. There is one more thing the shortcut is quietly lying about, and it is time. Every offer of this kind promises to compress a process that, by its very nature, simply takes as long as it takes. Some things cannot be rushed without being ruined. The way a fruit forced open early is not an early fruit, but a spoiled one. Trust gets built slowly, or it does not get built at all. Character sets like slow-poured concrete on its own schedule, ignoring your impatience entirely. The shortcut claims it can hand you in a single afternoon the sort of thing that only ever forms across long stretches of years, and time is precisely the one ingredient it has no power whatsoever to fake. What it actually delivers in place of the real thing is a convincing counterfeit of the finished article, missing only the years, which is another way of saying missing the single component that would have made it real in the first place, which is exactly why the man in the desert turned it down flat, and the logic of his refusal is worth spelling out because it is not the obvious one. On the surface, refusing rulership over all the kingdoms of the earth looks like a simple case of resisting greed, but it went far deeper than that. To accept the offer would have been to repeat, move for move, the original catastrophe we traced earlier, to take his instructions from the wrong voice, to switch his allegiance from the one who sent him to the one making the pitch, and in doing so to become just one more fallen deputy handing the world's authority to the wrong king. He would have gained the kingdoms and lost the entire reason for wanting them. And there is a further, quieter piece of logic underneath, one that is almost mathematical in its cleanness. A rebellion cannot be undone by staging a fresh rebellion. You do not fix a wrong turn by taking another wrong turn in a slightly different direction. The whole point of the second contestant walking onto the stage was to reverse the original defection, and you simply cannot reverse an act of disobedience by committing another one. The only thing that undoes a rebellion is its exact opposite: obedience, trust, the willing choice to stay under the authority you were tempted to climb out from under. Grabbing the shortcut would have meant becoming the disease he came to cure. His answer, once again, was a remembered line, this time the reminder that worship belongs to God alone, and service belongs to Him and to no one else. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. And that answer quietly exposes the hidden price tag on the whole glittering offer, the fine print the enemy very much hoped would go unread, because the kingdoms were not actually being offered for free. There was a condition attached, a single small act of allegiance required to close the deal, one bent knee in the wrong direction. That is the thing about every shortcut of this kind. It always looks free, and it never is. The cost is simply moved somewhere you are not looking, folded into terms you do not read until the transaction is already complete. And in this case, the cost was the whole self. To take the kingdoms by that route, he would have had to hand over the one thing that made him who he was, his undivided loyalty, and a man who trades away his loyalty to gain the world has, by definition, nothing left to rule the world with. And notice that the price was extracted specifically through worship, because that is not a random or decorative detail either. Worship in this whole story is simply the visible sign of where your deepest allegiance actually points, and as we established earlier, authority in this world flows toward whoever you are truly serving. So that one requested act, a single bent knee, was never a mere formality or an empty ritual to be shrugged through on the way to collecting the prize. It was the entire transfer mechanism compressed down into one small gesture. To bow was to declare a new master, and to declare a new master was, by the exact logic we traced right at the beginning, to hand over everything that came bundled with the old allegiance. The enemy was not asking for a polite little bow the way a host asks you to wipe your feet at the door. He was asking, in that one modest-looking motion, for the entire store, the whole deed, the same thing that had emptied the garden long before, now dressed up as a simple courtesy. And the man among the rocks recognized it instantly for exactly what it was, which is precisely why a gesture that small drew a refusal that total. So the real price of the shortcut, in the end, is everything you have. It presents itself as the cheapest possible option, the clever way around, the bargain that lets you keep your resources and skip ahead, and the truth is precisely inverted. It is the most expensive road there is because it quietly charges you your own self and hands you a hollow prize in exchange. The man in the desert saw straight through it and refused, but it is worth saying that this refusal was not the last time the offer would be put to him. This was the rehearsal, the version out among the rocks with the stakes laid out in plain sight. There was a later moment, in a very different sort of garden, when the same choice would come back around in its final and heaviest form, when the shortcut would be available right up to the last possible second, and the cost of refusing it would be laid bare in full. We are going to arrive at that garden before the end. For now, it is enough to notice that the second lever had been tried, the beautiful bypass had been offered and turned down, and the road, the long and costly one, remained the only road he was willing to walk. The third lever reaches deeper than either of the first two, deep enough that it does not really aim at what you want at all. The body lever went after what you crave to feel, and the eyes lever went after what you long to have. But this one skips past desire entirely and drives straight for something far more tender and far harder to defend. It goes after who you are, and because it strikes at identity rather than appetite, it is the quietest of the three, the hardest to catch in the act, and by a comfortable margin the most dangerous because you can usually feel a craving coming, but an attack on your sense of self tends to arrive disguised as a perfectly innocent question. Watch how it opens in the garden. The serpent leans in and promises the woman that if she takes the fruit, she and the man will become like gods themselves, knowing good and evil. Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. Now, we already looked at part of that line earlier at the way it dangled a shortcut, the chance to leap to a destination without walking the road. But there is a second edge on those same words, a deeper cut hiding underneath the shortcut, and it is the one that actually did the damage. Strip the promise down to what it whispers about the listener, and it says something quietly devastating. It says you are not enough as you currently are. It says there exists a better, upgraded, more complete version of you, a version worth having, and here's the twist of the knife. The one who made you has been deliberately keeping it from you, hoarding it, holding out on you. Sit with how much poison is packed into that one small suggestion, because it is doing two savage things at once, and both of them land before you have even noticed. The first is a slander against the giver. It quietly recasts the most generous figure in the entire story, the one who handed over a whole world as a gift, into a stingy withholder, a rival keeping the best thing locked in a cupboard out of spite. The second is a slander against the self. It takes a person who had, up to that exact moment, been perfectly content simply to be what they were made to be, and installs in them a brand new and entirely manufactured sense of lack, a nagging suspicion that they are somehow incomplete, deficient, a rough draft of a better person they are being denied. And once that suspicion is planted, the fruit practically sells itself because now it is not a forbidden object at all. It is the missing piece. It is the thing that will finally make you whole. Nobody has to be talked very hard into reaching for the thing they have just been convinced they were tragically lacking. Now watch the same lever get pulled on the man in the wilderness, because it gets repackaged so cleverly that most people never notice it is the identical move. The enemy sets him on the high point of the temple and says, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down." And there is a detail in the original wording that changes everything, and it is worth slowing down for. The little word translated as if is not really planting a seed of doubt about who the man is. In the Greek, the construction used carries the force of something much closer to since, or given that. It is not if you happen to be the Son of God, prove that shaky claim. It is far more like, since you are in fact the Son of God, as we both know perfectly well, surely you would not mind demonstrating it. The enemy is not questioning the identity at all. He knows exactly who he is talking to. What he is doing is far more subtle and far more sinister. He is taking the man's true identity, the realest and deepest fact about him, and attempting to turn it into a weapon and aim it back at its owner. And the timing of that attack is not an accident either, because it makes the sheer precision of the move visible once you notice it. Only a short while before this desert showdown, at the very start of everything, the man had heard his identity spoken over him directly and without a single condition attached. A voice from heaven had declared openly that this was the beloved Son, the one in whom there was full delight. No performance had been required to earn that declaration. No miracle had been demonstrated first, no resume submitted, no proof offered up in advance. The identity was simply given freely as a pure gift before the man had done one public thing to warrant it. And then, almost immediately afterward, out into the wilderness, comes the enemy to go to work on that exact declaration. The strategy is chillingly exact. He does not go poking around for some weak or uncertain corner of the man. He drives straight at the freshest, deepest, most freely given truth about him, and tries to convert it from a gift already received into a challenge that still has to be met. Prove the very thing that was just handed to you for nothing. That is the shape of the attack, and it is worth noticing precisely because it is the shape of the attack on you as well. The lever always reaches for the identity that was given and tries to turn it into an identity that must be earned. And that is the genuinely clever part of this third lever, the thing that makes it different from the other two. It does not always attack you by telling you that you are too little, the way it did in the garden. Sometimes it attacks you by agreeing enthusiastically that you are magnificent, and then using that very magnificence as the pressure. You are the Son of God, so prove it. You are so gifted, so special, so obviously destined, so surely you owe it to everyone, including yourself, to put that on display, to cash it in, to make it visible, to remove all doubt. One version of the lever says, you are not enough, go and become more. The other version says, you are so very much, go and demonstrate it. They look like opposites, but underneath they are the identical move because both of them do the same fatal thing. Both take your identity, which was meant to be something you simply receive and rest in, and convert it into something you now have to secure, defend, earn, or prove through some action. The moment who you are becomes a thing you have to establish rather than a thing you already are. The lever has caught, and it does not much matter whether it caught you by flattery or by insult. And most people, if they are honest with themselves, will find that one of those two versions has their name written on it far more than the other. Some are chronically vulnerable to the first form, the you are not enough version, and spend their lives quietly convinced they are a permanent rough draft, forever a few accomplishments short of finally being acceptable. Others are far more exposed to the second form, the you are magnificent, so prove it version, and spend their lives needing to display, to be admired, to have the specialness confirmed out loud one more time before the doubt creeps back. The enemy, being the careful strategist we already met, tends to notice which of the two doors happens to be unlocked in you and knocks firmly on that one. He will not waste the you are so gifted, show everyone pitch on a person crushed by feelings of smallness, and he will not waste the you are worthless line on someone already pleasantly intoxicated by their own importance. He fits the version of the lie to the shape of the person standing in front of him, which is exactly why two very different people can be caught by what look like opposite temptations and never once realize they were both worked by the very same tool, simply gripped from opposite ends. Because that, at the root, is what this deepest lever is really selling in every one of its disguises. It is trying to move your identity out of the category of gift and into the category of achievement. It wants to take the settled, restful fact of who you are and turn it into an open question, a debt that is forever coming due, a claim that requires constant fresh evidence or it lapses. It wants you to live as though your worth were a court case you have to keep winning day after day with no final verdict ever allowed. And a person living like that, forever gathering evidence for their own value, forever anxious that the case might collapse if they stop performing for even a moment, is a person who can be steered anywhere at all, simply by dangling the next thing that promises to finally settle the question for good. Which it never does, of course. That is the whole business model. There is one more feature of this lever that makes it uniquely hard to fight, and it is the voice it borrows. Unlike the cruder pulls, which tend to announce themselves plainly as wants, the identity attack almost never speaks in the second person. It does not say you should prove yourself in a tone you could readily identify as foreign and shove back against. It speaks in the first person. It says, I have to prove myself. I am not enough. I need to show them. Using your own inner narration, your own familiar voice, so that by the time the thought actually arrives, it is already wearing your face. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to resist, because attacking the thought feels almost indistinguishable from attacking yourself. You cannot easily argue with a whisper you have mistaken for your own conscience, and you certainly cannot defend yourself against an intruder you have not yet realized is an intruder. The first and hardest step, the one that has to come before any resistance is even possible, is simply noticing that the voice insisting you must earn your worth is not actually yours at all. It is a very old visitor that learned, a long time ago, to speak in the first person, and it has been getting away with the impersonation ever since, mostly because nobody thinks to check. And here is where the story turns genuinely strange, because there is a dark irony sitting underneath this third lever that most people walk right past, and once you see it, you cannot look away from it. This particular temptation, the pride, the grasping for a higher status, the refusal to simply be what you were made to be, and the drive to ascend into something greater, is the exact thing that ruined the tempter himself. There is an old and haunting passage that pulls back the curtain on his own downfall. And the words put in his mouth are all the same word, over and over climbing. I will ascend. I will raise my throne higher. I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 14. That was the appetite that unmade him. That was the precise flavor of pride that took a creature of staggering beauty and hollowed him out. And now, having been utterly destroyed by that specific poison, he spends his existence going door to door, selling the very same bottle to everyone else. It is worth lingering on that old passage for a moment because the anatomy of the fall it describes is unnervingly instructive. The lines are built almost entirely out of a single repeated phrase, and the phrase is I will ascend to the heavens. I will lift my throne higher. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of the gods. I will rise above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. 5 times over, the same 2 small words, each one another rung on a ladder pointed straight upward, and not a single one of them a request. There is no I would like, no might I, no if it is permitted. Just the flat, relentless assertion of a will bent entirely on climbing. And that, in miniature, is the whole nature of the thing. Pride is not merely thinking a bit too well of yourself, which is how we usually picture it, almost fondly. It is the refusal to receive the place you were given and the determination to seize a higher one, the quiet swapping of a granted identity for a grasped one, which is, naturally, the exact swap the enemy now spends his days trying to sell at every door. He knows the recipe from the inside, having been its first and most spectacular casualty, and he has been offering the identical climb, with the identical fall, waiting silently at the top of it, ever since. There is something almost absurd about it when you frame it plainly, and also something deeply chilling. Imagine taking financial advice from someone who is visibly and currently on fire because of a decision they just made. Imagine a man who lost everything he had at a rigged table, cheerfully waving you toward the same chair. That is the position of the one working this third lever. He is not a neutral salesman pushing a product he privately thinks is fine. He is a true believer in the thing that ruined him, a genuine convert to his own catastrophe, recruiting others into the exact trap that closed on him. He does not offer you pride the way you might offer a stranger a mint. He offers it the way a drowning man might drag someone else under, because on some level, misery of that particular kind does love company, and if the ascent was going to end in a fall, at least it will not be a fall he takes alone. He is selling the lie that melted him, and he is selling it hard. So learn to recognize this lever in your own ordinary days, because it is running far more often than you would guess, usually so quietly that it passes for your own inner voice rather than an intruder. It is the whisper that says you have to prove you are worth something, that your existence needs justifying, that you are only as valuable as your most recent achievement, and the meter resets to 0 every morning. It is the reason a resume can never feel quite long enough to silence the feeling, the reason one more accomplishment somehow never delivers the settled peace it promised, the reason the applause fades so fast and leaves you hungrier than before. That voice is not describing reality. It is running the third lever on you, trying to shift your worth from something quietly given to something anxiously earned. And it will keep you sprinting on that particular treadmill for as long as you believe the finish line is real. The single most freeing thing a person can discover is that the case was never actually open. There was no verdict to win because the worth was settled long before you did anything at all, handed over as a gift, exactly the way it was meant to be received in the first place. So there they are, all 3 levers laid out and taken apart, the body, the eyes, and the self, worked in turn on 2 different people in 2 different worlds. And here's the fact that should be nagging at you by now, the loose thread the whole middle of this story has been quietly leaving out. The attacks were the same, not similar, the same. The identical 3 moves in the identical order, run by the same strategist. And yet the 2 stories ended in exactly opposite places, one in ruin and one in victory, which means, and this is the hinge everything now turns on, the outcome was never actually decided by the attack. If the attacks were the same and the endings were different, then the thing that made the difference has to lie somewhere else entirely, not in what was done to each person, but in how each person answered. The whole question quietly moves from the strategy to the response, and that is exactly where we have to look next, because the real dividing line between the 2 stories turns out to be something almost nobody expects. The natural assumption when you notice that one person fell and the other stood is that the one who stood must simply have been stronger or luckier or better positioned. But run that theory against the actual facts and it falls apart in your hands, because if anything, the advantages ran entirely the wrong way. The one who fell was standing in paradise, well-fed, perfectly safe, at peace, with a full stomach and unlimited good options, facing the enemy at full strength. The one who stood was out in a wasteland, starving, exhausted, alone, at the absolute floor of human endurance, facing the enemy with nothing left in the tank. If strength and circumstance decided these things, the outcomes would have been the exact reverse of what actually happened. Comfort lost, depletion won. So whatever the deciding factor was, it plainly was not conditions, and it plainly was not raw willpower either, because the person with every earthly advantage is the one who folded. There is only one variable left standing once you have eliminated all the others, and it is a quiet one, easy to overlook, and it turns out to be the whole thing. The entire difference between the two comes down to how each one handled the Word of God. Not their strength, not their setting, not their mood, not their willpower reserves. Their relationship to what had actually been said to them. And the moment you look at the two encounters through that single lens, the whole mystery of why one collapsed and one held firm resolves into something almost embarrassingly clear. Watch the woman first, and watch closely, because the failure begins long before the fruit is ever touched. Her very first move, before anything else goes wrong, is that she enters into a conversation. She lets the question be asked, entertains it, turns it over, and begins to discuss the terms. That alone is a quiet, strategic disaster, because when the other party at the table is a professional deceiver, agreeing to a friendly negotiation is roughly on the level of handing your wallet to a stranger who has just explained at length why he loves wallets. But the truly revealing part comes next, in what she actually says, because when she repeats the rule back, she gets it subtly wrong. She reports that they were told not to eat from the tree and not to touch it. Genesis chapter 3, verse 3. And here's the thing. The original instruction, the one actually given earlier, said nothing whatsoever about touching. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. It said only, do not eat. The do not touch was never part of it. And it is worth backing up one step further still to the very first thing the serpent ever says, because the mishandling of the word did not actually begin with the woman at all. It began with a question, and a beautifully crafted one. The opening move is not a flat contradiction, not a bold "you will certainly not die," which would have been far too obvious and far too easy to reject on the spot. It is a question, tilted just slightly off true. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And notice the quiet damage that question does. It takes a wildly generous permission, eat freely from every tree here but one, and subtly reframes it as a stingy, suspicious prohibition, as though the entire arrangement had been about the single restriction rather than the vast abundance surrounding it on every side. It inflates the one limit and quietly erases all the freedom, and it does the whole thing inside an innocent-sounding request for clarification. The word was already being bent before anyone had laid so much as a finger on the fruit, not by open denial, but by a slanted question that recast a good and open-handed instruction as a mean-spirited rule. That is almost always how it starts, incidentally, very rarely with a bold, obvious lie, nearly always with a small, reasonable-sounding question that quietly slides the frame a few inches to the left. Now, that little addition seems minor, even admirable at first glance, the sort of extra caution a careful person might add for safety. But look at what it actually reveals, because it is doing real damage under the surface. The word had already been stretched and edited before the serpent made a single move, and we cannot even be certain who did the editing, whether the woman added the clause herself, or whether it came to her secondhand, already altered in the retelling by the man who first received it. Either way, the text she was defending herself with was no longer the text she had been given. It had been quietly revised. And an added rule, a self-built fence around the real one, is far more fragile than it looks, because a fence you constructed yourself is a fence you know, deep down you are free to move later. The moment the touching turned out to be harmless, which it did, the whole structure was primed to collapse, and the real command was set to collapse right along with the fake one bolted onto it. And there is a deeper principle hiding inside that harmless-looking addition, one worth stating plainly, because it cuts against what most people quietly assume. We tend to picture tampering with the word as strictly a matter of taking things away, softening it, loosening it, snipping out the parts we would rather not deal with. But adding to it is the very same act wearing the opposite costume. Building an extra fence around a command, making it stricter than it was actually given, feels like devotion, like taking the thing even more seriously than required, like being the good and careful one. In reality, it is the identical move because both the trimming and the padding sit you down in exactly the same chair. The one who adds to the word and the one who subtracts from it are both underneath, editing it, and both have quietly made themselves its author rather than its hearer. This is why rigid, showy strictness and easygoing, permissive looseness, which look for all the world like sworn enemies glaring at each other across a room, are so often secretly the same thing at the root. Both are forms of taking personal control of the text. Both are the hand of the editor reaching for the red pen, differing only in which direction they choose to scribble. An offense built too high for show, it turns out, comes down just as readily as a rule quietly ignored, because neither one is any longer the thing that was actually said. But the deepest tell of all is what she does with the warning itself, because she treats it as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a word to be trusted. She reaches out, she takes, she eats, and crucially, she does not immediately fall down dead. And in that pause, in that little gap where the predicted consequence does not instantly arrive, the warning gets quietly reclassified in her mind from a solemn word to be obeyed into a claim to be checked, an experiment to be run, a theory that has apparently just been disproven. And then she hands it on, passing the fruit to the man as if to say, "Look, I tried it, and here I still am. The warning must have been an exaggeration." The word had been demoted from something you stand on to something you poke at to see if it holds. And that demotion, that quiet reclassification of the word from foundation to hypothesis, was the actual fall. The fruit was just the receipt. Which points to the principle underneath all of it, the thing that was really going wrong the whole time. The instant a person begins adjusting the word to fit their situation, trimming it here, padding it there, softening the hard parts, testing the uncomfortable parts, editing it down to something more manageable, they have already made a far bigger move than they realize. They have quietly climbed up into the position of authority over it. They have appointed themselves its editor, its judge, the one who decides which parts are literal and which are flexible and which can be safely set aside today. As we saw much earlier, the original catastrophe was fundamentally a reach for the judge's seat. And this is that identical reach, aimed now at the word itself. To edit the word is to sit above the word, and the one who sits above it has, in that very act, stopped listening to it. Now set the man in the wilderness beside her, and the contrast could not be sharper or cleaner. 3 separate attacks come at him, and 3 times he answers, and every single time the answer takes the same form. It is written. Not, "Here is my opinion." Not, "Well, in my personal interpretation." Not, "Let me offer a thoughtful counterpoint." Simply, "It is written," followed by a precise quotation, delivered exactly as it stood, with not one word added for emphasis and not one word softened for comfort. He does not enter the negotiation the way the woman did. He does not turn the words over looking for wiggle room. He does not workshop them or nuance them or explain the historical context or find the reasonable middle path. He plants himself on the text precisely as it was given and lets it do the talking, refusing to become its editor even when editing it would have made his immediate life dramatically easier. He does not stand over the word deciding what it really means for him today. He stands under it and lets it stand over him. And do not miss the strange power sitting in how little he actually says, because the sheer brevity is itself a large part of the defense. A lie thrives on conversation. It wants to be discussed, weighed, engaged with at length, given a long and fair hearing, because every extra minute of dialogue is another minute it can spend hunting for a crack. The longer you debate a temptation on its own chosen terms, the more likely it becomes to win. Not because it is right, but simply because it is endlessly patient and you are not. By answering with a plain, closed statement and then nothing further, the man in the wilderness denies the lie the one thing it most desperately needs, which is airtime. He does not open the floor to a nuanced discussion of whether the rule might perhaps allow for exceptions in unusual circumstances such as, for instance, his own. He does not concede that the question is even genuinely open. He states what stands, and then he is simply finished. There is a quiet mastery in that refusal to elaborate, because he had grasped something the woman never did, that certain offers are not meant to be answered thoughtfully and at length. They are meant to be closed. The strongest possible reply to some questions is to decline politely and completely, to treat them as real questions at all. And there is the whole thing compressed into a single image you should carry with you for the rest of this story. The woman stood over the word, and so it moved under her feet, because anything you stand over you are also free to reshape, and anything you can reshape cannot hold you up when the ground starts to shift. The man stood under the word, and so it held him fast, immovable, because a thing you have submitted to is a thing that can anchor you, precisely because you have surrendered the right to bend it. That is the entire difference between the two endings laid bare. One treated the word as clay to be worked, and clay, it turns out, makes a terrible foundation. The other treated it as rock to be stood upon, and rock, unglamorous and unyielding as it is the only thing that holds when everything else is being shaken. It is worth pausing on how backward this feels, because our instincts get it exactly wrong. Standing over something looks like the position of strength and mastery, the confident posture of the one in charge who gets to decide. Standing under something looks like weakness, like submission, like giving up your own judgment. But in this arena, the appearances are precisely inverted. The one who stands over the word, free to edit and adjust it, has nothing fixed left to hold on to because they have made themselves the highest authority in the room. And a person who is their own highest authority is a person adrift, with no point of reference that does not move the moment they want it to. The one who stands under the word has surrendered the power to change it, yes, but in exchange has gained something the other can never have, an anchor that does not shift with their moods, a fixed point outside themselves that the storm cannot argue with. Submission, in this one strange case, turns out to be the stronger position, and mastery turns out to be the one that quietly sinks. There is even a hidden freedom in the lower position that the higher one never gets to taste, and it is worth naming, because it sounds impossible right up until you have actually felt it. The one who has made himself the final editor of everything is quietly condemned to decide everything endlessly from scratch, with no ground beneath him that he did not have to pour himself that very morning. Every situation becomes a fresh negotiation. Every rule becomes a matter to be relitigated from the beginning. Every settled question springs open again the moment it becomes inconvenient. That is not freedom. That is exhaustion wearing a convincing mask of freedom. The one who has instead planted himself beneath a fixed word is spared the whole grinding ordeal. He does not have to reinvent the ground every time the wind shifts, because the ground was settled long before he arrived and will still be there long after he leaves. Having surrendered the right to argue with it, he is finally free to simply stand on it and rest his weight. The person who submitted gained the one thing the self-appointed authority can never purchase at any price, which is the deep and unfamiliar relief of no longer having to be God of his own small and endlessly shifting universe. And lest all of this feel like an ancient problem safely sealed off in the distant past, notice how effortlessly we still perform the exact same maneuver, usually without ever quite admitting it to ourselves. Very few people in the modern world reject an inconvenient truth outright, the way you might slam a door in someone's face. That would feel crude, and worse, it would feel like open defiance, which requires actually owning up to what you are doing. So instead, we have perfected the far softer art of standing over a thing while sincerely believing we are standing under it. We interpret the hard parts gently into harmlessness. We decide with tremendous sophistication and a slightly pained expression that a given instruction was surely meant for another era, another culture, another sort of person, certainly not for us, here, now, in our own very reasonable and clearly exceptional case. We do not deny the word. We would never be so unsubtle. We simply keep adjusting it ever so delicately until it happens to arrive at precisely the conclusion we already wanted, at which point we congratulate ourselves warmly on our nuanced and mature understanding. It is the identical reach for the editor's chair the woman made in the garden, only carried out now with a richer vocabulary and a far more apologetic tone. The red pen, however thoughtfully it is held, is still a red pen. So hold on tight to that pairing, the over and the under, because it is the real key to the whole story, far more than the fruit or the bread or the kingdoms ever were. The battle was never actually about any of those objects. Underneath every one of the three levers, in the garden and in the wilderness alike, the real contest was always the same, and it was this: when the Word of God stands in front of you, plain and inconvenient and refusing to bend, Will you climb above it and start editing? Or will you place yourself beneath it and let it hold you? That single question decided everything, then and now. And it is going to come back in a form you will not see coming at the very end of all this. So keep the over and the under close. We are nowhere near finished with it. There is one more thing about those three answers that we walked straight past, and it is the sort of small detail that, once you actually notice it, quietly rearranges the whole story around itself. Go back and look at where each of the three replies came from. Every single one of them, all three, was pulled from the exact same book. Not three scattered quotations gathered from across the whole library of Scripture, plucked from wherever happened to be handy, but three lines drawn from one single source, reached for again and again like a man dipping into the same familiar well. The book is Deuteronomy, and the three answers sit at chapter 8, verse 3, chapter 6, verse 16, and chapter 6, verse 13. That is not a coincidence, and it is not because it was simply the book he had read most recently. It is the key that unlocks the entire encounter, and almost nobody stops long enough to pick it up. To understand why that matters, you have to know what Deuteronomy actually is, because the name makes it sound like a legal appendix nobody would read voluntarily. It is, in fact, one long look backward. Deuteronomy is essentially a farewell address, the final speech of Moses, delivered right at the edge of the Promised Land to a generation about to walk into it, and its whole subject is the 40 years the people had just spent wandering in the wilderness. It is the great retelling, the where we have been and what it was supposed to teach us speech, stretched to a length that makes your grandfather's longest dinner story look positively brisk. And the reason that book, of all books, was the one the man in the desert reached into three separate times is that he was not standing in just any wilderness. He was standing in the wilderness, the same kind of proving ground, facing the same kind of tests that the whole book he was quoting had been written to make sense of. He was not grabbing random ammunition. He was reaching very deliberately for the lessons of a specific earlier story, because he had recognized that he was standing inside a rerun of it. And it is worth asking why the wilderness, of all the places available, keeps turning up as the classroom in these stories, because it is not the obvious choice. If you wanted to teach a son to trust you, you might reasonably assume that comfort would do the job better, a warm house and a full table and everything quietly provided. But the desert does something comfort simply cannot. It strips a person down to nothing but the relationship itself. Out there, with no reserves, no backup plan, no comfortable margin to fall back on, every prop a person normally leans on instead of leaning on God gets removed, one by one, until trust is no longer one option among many, but the only thing left standing upright. That is precisely the point of the place. The wilderness is not a punishment cell. It is a furnace with a purpose, a stripped, bare room where it finally becomes visible whether a heart actually trusts or has merely been coasting along on how comfortable everything happened to be. Comfort can hide a faithless heart indefinitely, because a heart that never once has to depend on anyone looks exactly like a heart that trusts. Remove the cushions, and the difference shows up almost at once. So let us go back to that earlier story, because it is the piece almost everyone is missing, and without it, the desert scene looks far smaller than it actually is. Long before any of this, a whole people had been rescued out of slavery, and the way that rescue gets described is worth pausing on. When the demand for their release first goes out, it is not framed as a labor dispute or a political negotiation. It is framed as a family matter. The message delivered to the ruler holding them is, in effect, that this nation is God's firstborn son, and the son is to be let go. Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. Read that again and let it land. The rescue was never really the story of a slave revolt. It was the story of a father coming to reclaim a son. And once you see the people through that lens, as a son rather than merely a crowd, everything that happens to them afterward takes on a completely different weight. And it changes how you read the testing, too, once the family framing is properly in place. When a stranger puts you under pressure, it is an attack, plain and simple. When a father lets his child face something genuinely difficult, it is something else entirely, even though the pressure itself may look identical from the outside. A good father does not wrap a child in cotton wool forever, not because he enjoys watching them struggle, but because he intends them for something. And the something requires a strength that only ever grows under a bit of weight. He lets the child carry the load that is just slightly too heavy, staying close the entire time, precisely because he loves them enough to want them capable rather than merely comfortable. Read the wilderness through that lens and it stops looking like abandonment. The son was not dumped in the desert and forgotten about. He was led there on purpose by a father who was forming him, testing whether the trust was real, and staying near enough the whole time to provide bread on the ground each morning while he did it. Which, as it happens, is precisely the same pattern that will later play out with the true son, led into the same kind of place by the same kind of hand. Because that son, once freed, was led directly out into the wilderness, and there, over the course of 40 long years, he was tested, not tormented for the fun of it, but tested, the way a father tests whether a child has actually learned to trust him. And the tests came in 3 main flavors, which, if you have been following along, are going to sound eerily familiar. There was the test of hunger when the food ran out and the people had to depend on a strange bread that simply appeared on the ground each morning, provided daily, deliberately never in a storable surplus, so that they had to trust for it fresh every single day. There was the test of whether they would demand that God prove himself on command, which came to a head at a place where they ran short of water and effectively put the whole rescue on trial, demanding a sign as the price of their continued cooperation. And there was the test of worship, of whether they would keep their loyalty fixed on the one who had rescued them or hand it off to something more convenient the moment he seemed slow to appear. That daily bread arrangement, incidentally, was designed with a precision that borders on the pointed. The strange food could be gathered each morning, enough for that one day and not a crumb more. And anyone who tried to hoard a surplus against tomorrow to quietly build up a little private stockpile and escape the daily dependence, found it spoiled and crawling with worms by the next sunrise. The single exception was the day before the day of rest, when a double portion could be gathered and that once would keep. In other words, the entire system was engineered specifically to make stockpiling impossible and daily trust unavoidable. It was a 40-year lesson in receiving your provision fresh from the giver rather than securing yourself against ever having to depend on him, a daily rehearsal of the exact posture the first man had thrown away when he grasped instead of received. And it is hard to imagine a lesson more patiently taught or more thoroughly ignored, because the same people who watched bread appear on the ground every single morning for decades still somehow managed to spend a great deal of that time loudly convinced they were about to starve to death at any moment. And here's the uncomfortable part, the part that makes the whole thing a tragedy rather than a triumph. In each of those 3 tests, the son failed. When the hunger came, the people did not trust and wait. They grumbled bitterly and at length, and began romanticizing their former slavery, apparently remembering their time in bondage chiefly for its reliable catering, which is a remarkable thing for the human memory to prioritize. When the water ran short, they did not remember that this was the same God who had recently split an entire sea down the middle to get them out, a feat you would think might buy a little credit in the trust department. Instead, they demanded fresh proof on the spot, testing the one who had already proven himself more dramatically than anyone in history. And when their leader was gone slightly longer than expected up on the mountain, they did not wait patiently. They pooled their jewelry, melted it down, shaped it into a young bull, and started worshiping it, having been free for a grand total of a few weeks before deciding what their liberation had really been missing was a metal cow. 3 tests, 3 failures, 1 from hunger, 1 from doubt, and 1 from impatience, and every single one of them a failure of a son who would not, in the crucial moment, trust his father. Now stand the 2 wilderness stories side by side and watch what happens, because this is the reveal the entire chapter has been building toward. The man in the desert, the true son, walks into the same wilderness and faces the same 3 tests, in essence, the identical exam the first son had sat and flunked. He faces the test of hunger, and he faces the demand to make God prove himself on command by leaping from a height and forcing a rescue, and he faces the offer to redirect his worship toward something other than the Father. The same 3, hunger, the testing of God, and worship, arriving in the same wilderness setting. There is even a deliberate echo built into the numbers. The first son was tested for 40 years. The true son was tested for 40 days. And where the first son failed all 3, the true son passed all 3, which means, if you want to be blunt about it, that he cleared in 40 days, the exact examination it had taken an entire nation 40 years to fail. Whether you find that encouraging or mildly humbling probably depends on how your own week is going. But the truly stunning part is not merely that he passed the same tests, it is how he passed them. Each time, the words he reached for were not just any scripture. They were the exact lines from that farewell speech in which those very failures were being remembered and explained. When the hunger came at him, he answered with the line about not living on bread alone, which is drawn from the passage looking directly back at the manna and what it had been meant to teach. When the demand to force a divine rescue came, he answered with the warning not to put God to the test, which points straight back at that place where the first son had done exactly that over the water. And when the offer of worship in the wrong direction came, he answered with the command to worship and serve God alone, the very principle the first son had shattered when he bowed to the metal calf. He was not simply defending himself with handy verses. He was walking back through the precise scenes of the earlier failure one by one and getting right each thing that had been gotten wrong, using the very words that had been written to mourn the original defeat. And there is something quietly beautiful in the fact that he needed no new material at all to win. He did not reach for some fresh revelation, some secret weapon that had been unavailable to the sons who failed before him. He reached for the exact same words those earlier sons had already been handed and had failed to live by. The instructions had been sitting there the whole time, written down, passed along, freely available to anyone who cared to open the book. Nothing had ever been missing from the toolkit. What had always been missing was a son willing to actually stand on the words instead of editing them or testing them or quietly setting them aside the moment they turned inconvenient. Which means the victory out in the desert was not the discovery of some brand new truth. It was the first faithful performance of a very old one. The rescue of the whole failing line did not come through better information or a cleverer plan. It came through one son finally doing what the words had plainly said all along, which is, when you sit with it, a strangely hopeful thing, because it means the answer was never hidden or complicated in the first place. It was simply, for the very first time, obeyed. And that changes the whole picture in a way that is genuinely hard to overstate. Up to this point, we have mostly been watching a two-person comparison, the first man in the garden set against the man in the desert, the one who grasped set against the one who refused. And that comparison is real, and it holds. He is, in that sense, a kind of second version of the first man, walking the same kind of test and undoing the original disaster. But this Deuteronomy connection reveals that he is doing something even larger at the same time, on a second track running underneath the first. He is not only redoing the first man, he is also redoing the whole nation, the failed firstborn son, succeeding at the family test that an entire people had failed across 4 decades of wandering. He is, in other words, the true and faithful son, the one who finally does what son after son had failed to do, which is simply to trust the Father when it was hard. Step back far enough and a long pattern comes into focus that you cannot see from up close. The wilderness, all through this ancient library, keeps showing up as the same kind of place, the proving ground where God forms and tests his sons, the stripped-down arena where it becomes clear whether a heart will trust or grasp when everything comfortable has been taken away. And the pattern across that whole history is a discouraging one because the sons keep failing there. The first man failed his test in a garden rather than a desert, but the shape was the same. The rescued nation, the firstborn son, failed its test in the wilderness across 40 years. Son after son, chance after chance, the same collapse of trust in the same kind of testing place. And then, at long last, one son walks into that same arena, faces the same accumulated pressure, carries the weight of every earlier failure on his shoulders, and does not break. He does not merely pass a personal exam. He reaches back and redeems the entire history of failed sons in a single stretch of 40 days, unwinding not just one man's mistake, but a long, sad chain of them all at once, which means the scene we have been examining is not the isolated little episode it first appears to be, one man having a rough month among the rocks. It is the finale of something enormous, the climax of a story that had been running and failing for a very long time, the moment the whole long line of collapsed sons finally gets turned around by one who would not collapse. It adds a third figure to the comparison we have been tracing. The nation standing alongside the first man, and it makes the entire thing far larger and far more moving than a simple contest of willpower. The man in the desert was not just resisting 3 clever temptations. He was quietly rewriting the ending of a story that had been ending badly since the very beginning. And that raises a question we have been circling for a while now without ever landing on it directly, a question that is going to flip the whole way you think about that desert and about your own hard places too. We have been describing all of this as the enemy's operation, his 3 levers, his careful strategy, his patient timing. But step back and ask the simplest possible question about the scene, the one almost nobody asks. If it was such a proving ground, such a deliberate test with such a clear design running through it, then who exactly set the test up? Because a test with a purpose does not arrange itself. To answer that, we need to draw a distinction that most people never think to make, and it quietly overturns the entire idea of what a temptation even is. Here it is, as plainly as it can be put. One and the same event can be 2 completely different things at once, depending entirely on who stands behind it and what they intend by it. From one angle, it is a temptation, an attempt to make someone fall, to break them, to drag them down, and that angle belongs to the enemy. From another angle, the very same event is a test, an examination designed to reveal what is truly there and to strengthen it, and that angle belongs to God. Not 2 separate events. One event, wearing 2 faces, pulled in 2 opposite directions by 2 very different intentions. And the languages the old texts were written in quietly confirm this, in a way that is almost too neat. In the original Hebrew, the word that gets used for this kind of trial is nasa, and in the Greek, the corresponding word is peirazo. And here is the striking thing about both of them. Neither word means only tempt, and neither word means only test. Each single word carries both meanings at once, folded together into one term. The languages themselves did not bother to build 2 separate words to keep the concepts apart, because at the level of the actual event, there is no separating them. It is the same trial. What determines whether it functions as a wrecking ball or a refining fire is not the event itself, but the hand behind it and the goal it is aimed at. And it is worth sitting with the fact that this double meaning is not a bug in the ancient languages, some clumsy failure to be precise about important things. It is telling you something true about the nature of reality itself. A trial simply is a neutral thing at the level of the raw event, a fork in the road that can go either way, and the very same pressure that would shatter one person will strengthen another. The old texts refuse to hand you 2 clean, separate words because handing you 2 words would let you pretend the 2 are unrelated, that tests and temptations are entirely different creatures that never once overlap. They are not different creatures. They are the same creature viewed from 2 sides, which also quietly implies something that is easy to walk right past, namely that God was never for a moment caught off guard by the existence of temptation. The possibility of being tested, of facing a genuine fork where you really could fall, was not an unfortunate accident that slipped into the world while no one was watching the door. It was built in from the very start, a necessary feature rather than a flaw because, as we saw a good while back, a trust that could never once be tested would not actually be trust at all, only wiring. You cannot have real suns without real tests, and you cannot have a real test without a real live possibility of failing it. Now that could sound alarming at first, as though it makes God the author of temptation, which would be a genuinely disturbing idea. So it needs to be said very clearly, because the texts themselves are careful about exactly this point. God tempts no one with evil. It is stated flatly and directly. James chapter 1, verse 13. He is never the one whispering the seductive suggestion, never the voice trying to make you fall. That role is not his and never has been. But testing is a different matter entirely, and testing he does, the way a refiner puts gold into the fire. Notice that the fire is not there to destroy the gold. It is there to burn away everything that is not gold, to bring out the pure thing hiding inside the raw ore. The heat is real, the process is uncomfortable, and the very same flame that refines gold would happily reduce a lesser thing to ash. Same fire, opposite outcomes, and all the difference lies in what is placed into it and why. There is a detail in that image of the refiner that makes it a great deal warmer than it first sounds, and it is worth drawing out. A refiner does not light the fire, walk away, and hope for the best. He sits with the metal the entire time, watching it closely, because gold left in the fire even a moment too long is ruined just as surely as gold that was never refined at all. He controls the heat with real care, raising it only as high as the work actually requires and not a single degree beyond. And he knows precisely when the job is finished. There is an old saying about the craft, that the refiner knows the gold is ready at the exact moment he can look down into the molten surface and see his own face reflected back at him clearly. Whether or not that is literally how the work was done, the picture is getting at something exactly right. The fire is not cruelty, and it is not indifference either. It is close, attentive, controlled work, aimed at a specific and genuinely beautiful result, tended by someone who never once looks away and who fully intends to pull the gold out at precisely the right moment, no sooner and no later. That is a very different thing from being abandoned to a blaze that nobody is watching and nobody is minding. There's a classic case buried deep in the older writings that shows exactly how this works, and it is worth walking through because it settles the whole question of who is actually in charge. In the story of a man named Job, a good man who suddenly loses nearly everything, the curtain gets pulled back and we are shown the scene behind the scene, and it is not at all what you would expect. The accuser, the adversary, the one who wants to break the man cannot simply do it. He has to come and present himself before the throne first. He has to request access. He has to ask permission to touch anything at all. And when permission is granted, it comes with strict, explicit limits, a line drawn in advance that he is not allowed to cross. Only within those set boundaries can he act, and not 1 inch beyond them. Put bluntly, the adversary in that story cannot so much as rearrange the man's furniture without first obtaining a signed permission slip, which is not the picture of an all-powerful free agent most people carry around in their heads. And once you really absorb the shape of that arrangement, it carries an implication that is oddly steadying. If the adversary cannot act at all without first passing through a gate of permission, then nothing that ever reaches you has arrived completely unfiltered. Every blow that actually lands has, by the logic of that scene, already passed through a checkpoint, already been measured against a limit, already been permitted only up to a set and unmovable line. That does not make the blow hurt any less, and it is not meant to. The losses in that man's story were staggering and real, and no one watching would dare call them small or tidy. But there is a genuine world of difference between suffering that is pure chaos, arriving from nowhere with no boundary and no ceiling of any kind, and suffering that, however severe it gets, has passed through a hand that set its limits in advance. The first kind is a free fall with nothing underneath it. The second, terrible as it may be, is a fall with a floor somewhere beneath it, even when you cannot see the floor and have no idea at all how far down it lies. The enemy in these stories is never handed the whole leash. He is handed exactly as much of it as serves a purpose he does not understand and would despise if he did. And that turns out to be the pattern everywhere you look, not a one-time exception. Nowhere in the entire library of these texts does the enemy ever operate as a truly independent power, running loose and doing whatever he pleases outside anyone's control. He is real and he is dangerous, and none of that is being minimized here. But he is never sovereign. He is always in the end on a leash, permitted to go this far and no further, operating strictly within limits that were set by a higher hand before he ever showed up. He is a genuine threat who is nonetheless at every moment contained, a wolf that is real enough to hurt you but is somehow always found, on close inspection, to be moving inside a fence he did not build and cannot climb. Bring that back to the desert now, and the whole scene reorganizes itself in front of you. What looked from ground level like a straightforward ambush, the enemy sneaking up on an exhausted man to break him, turns out to be something quite different once you can see the whole board. It was, at the very same time, a testing ground, deliberately arranged, permitted, and bounded, with a real purpose running underneath it. One single scene, and 2 entirely different intentions layered on top of each other. The enemy came into it wanting a collapse, but the collapse was never the point of the exercise, only the risk built into it. Underneath the enemy's intention to destroy ran a deeper intention to reveal, to bring out into the open the genuine, unbreakable trust of a true son, tested to the limit and found solid. For anyone carrying a hard season of their own, this is quietly one of the most freeing things in the whole story, so let it sit for a moment. If the same principle holds, and the texts insist that it does, then a hard trial is not necessarily the random, meaningless cruelty it can feel like from inside. It may instead be permitted rather than accidental, which means it did not slip past anyone unnoticed. It may be limited rather than unbounded, which means it has a ceiling, a line the pressure is not allowed to cross no matter how limitless it feels in the middle of the night. And it may be purposeful rather than pointless, which means there is a design running through it even when the design is completely invisible from where you are standing. A test with a ceiling and a purpose is a categorically different thing from a disaster with neither, even when from the inside, on the worst day, the two can feel identical. The obvious objection, the one that rises almost immediately, runs like this. If the pressure can be limited, if a ceiling can be set on it, then why permit the fire at all? Why not simply spare the gold, the heat entirely, and hand over the finished thing directly? And the honest answer is that there is no such thing as finished gold that skipped the fire. In exactly the same way, there is no such thing as a proven strength that was never once tested. Strength that has never met any resistance is not strength yet. It is only untested potential, a claim that nobody, including its owner, has ever actually checked. Trust that has never been given a real reason to waver is not yet trust. It is merely an assumption that has not so far been challenged. The trial is not an arbitrary hoop bolted onto the front of the reward for no reason. It is the very thing that turns a possibility into a reality, in the same way that lifting weight is what turns the mere idea of a muscle into an actual one. None of this makes a hard season pleasant, and none of it is meant to be handed, like a neat little explanation, to someone standing in the middle of real pain, where it would land as cold comfort at best. But it does mean the fire is not pointless, which, when you happen to be the one standing in it, is a genuinely different thing from the fire being meaningless, even if in the moment the difference is nearly impossible to feel. The clearest way to hold the difference is to notice that the two forces pulling on the very same event are aimed in exactly opposite directions. The tempter is aiming downward. His entire goal is your breaking, your collapse, the moment you finally give way and prove to be as hollow as he insists you are. The tester is aiming in the other direction entirely. His goal is not your breaking, but your becoming. The moment the pressure squeezes out something genuine and solid that no one, least of all you, was sure was in there. The enemy runs the test, hoping to demonstrate that you are worthless. God permits the very same test in order to bring into the light what is actually real and good and durable in you. The pressure is identical. The intended destination is the precise opposite. And which of those two the trial finally serves has a great deal to do with which of the two hands you keep your eyes on while you are standing in the fire. There is a final twist in all of this that is almost funny, in a grim sort of way, and it quietly sets up everything that comes next. In this arrangement, the enemy's malice does not merely get tolerated or permitted, it gets conscripted. The very attack he launches in order to break a person becomes, without his consent, and flatly against his whole purpose, the exact occasion on which the genuine thing gets to show itself. He shows up to prove that the trust is fake, and the pressure he applies turns out to be the very thing that proves it is real. He means it entirely for destruction, and it comes out the other side as revelation. He is, in other words, working overtime to produce the precise result he most wanted to prevent, rather like an arsonist who keeps accidentally forging the very steel he had been trying to melt into slag. And if his hostility can be turned that thoroughly against his own aims while he still cheerfully imagines he is the one running the whole show, then a question starts to press in with real force. Just how far back does that reversal actually go? Was he ever running the show at all, or had he been handed his part in it long before he ever arrived, believing the entire time that the idea had been his own? Which leaves us standing right at the edge of something even stranger, and it is the thing this whole chapter has been quietly walking us toward, because so far we have only said that God permitted the test, allowed it, set boundaries around it, and used it for his own purposes. That alone rearranges a great deal. But it turns out that permitting is not nearly the whole of it. The initiative behind that desert scene goes deeper, much deeper than mere allowance, deep enough that the enemy's supposed ambush was not something God reluctantly tolerated at all, but something engineered from the other side entirely, with the enemy playing a role he never once suspected he had been cast in. Exactly how thoroughly that whole thing was flipped around, who was truly the hunter and who was truly the prey, is where we are going next. and it is the moment this entire story turns over completely. Before we turn the whole board over and finally see who was truly hunting whom, we have to circle back to that first garden one last time, because there has been someone standing quietly in the corner of the scene this entire while, and we have walked right past him at every turn. We have spent a great deal of attention on the woman and on the serpent, on the offer and the reach and the mishandled word, and in all of that we have quietly let one figure fade into the background, exactly the way the story itself almost lets him. There is a small phrase attached to the moment of the fall that most people read straight over without a flicker, and once you catch it, it changes the whole complexion of the scene. When the fruit is finally taken and eaten, the text adds, almost in passing, that she gave some also to her husband who was with her. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Who was with her? He was there. He was there the entire time. Sit with that for a second, because it quietly detonates a comfortable assumption almost everyone carries. We tend to picture the man arriving on the scene afterward, wandering in later, being handed the fruit by his already fallen wife, and going along with it out of some misplaced loyalty, a sort of innocent bystander who got talked into it after the real damage was done. That is not what the text says. It says he was with her, present, standing right there through the whole exchange, within earshot of every word the serpent spoke, watching the entire negotiation unfold in real time. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Through all of it, the questioning, the twisting of the command, the slander against the giver, the slow reeling in of his wife, he says nothing, he does nothing. He does not step forward, does not object, does not correct the lie he had every ability to correct, does not stand between the predator and the one he was supposed to protect. He simply stands there, silent, and then, when the fruit is passed to him, he takes it. The least heroic performance imaginable from someone who had, moments earlier, been handed the run of an entire world. And there is a further detail that makes his silence heavier still, one that is easy to forget because it happened earlier in the story. The command about the tree, the single rule of the whole place, had originally been given to the man directly, before the woman had even been formed. He was the one who received it firsthand, straight from the source, in plain and unmistakable words, which means that when the serpent began twisting that very command, subtly misquoting it, and reframing a generous permission into a stingy prohibition, the man standing there was the one person present who had heard the original with his own ears. He was, in effect, the resident expert on exactly what had and had not been said. He was uniquely equipped to lean in and say, plainly, that is not what we were told. He had both the knowledge and the standing to shut the entire thing down with a single sentence, and he used neither. He let a lie about a rule he personally knew firsthand go completely unchallenged, in front of the very person that lie was aimed at. It is one thing to fail to defend against a threat you do not understand. It is quite another to stand silent while a swindle you can see through unfolds right in front of you, aimed squarely at someone you were meant to protect. And this is the first bridegroom's actual failure, and it is worth naming precisely, because it is a different kind of failure than his wife's, and the difference matters enormously. Her failure was active. She reached, she took, she did something. His failure was passive. He failed by doing nothing at all, by staying quiet when a word from him might have changed everything, by remaining a spectator at the exact moment he was called to be a protector. The whole point of a bridegroom, in the logic of this story, is to stand between his bride and the threat, to put himself in harm's way on her behalf, to be the one who steps up when something dangerous walks into the room. And when the most dangerous thing that had ever existed walked into that room and set to work on his wife, the first bridegroom's contribution was to watch with his hands in his pockets and then accept a snack. It is a portrait of a very particular kind of collapse. The collapse not of someone who does the wrong thing, but of someone who, when everything is on the line, does nothing whatsoever. That passivity is worth lingering on, because it tends to be the quieter and more socially acceptable of the two failures, and therefore the easier to miss and to excuse. We are very good at recognizing the sin of the person who acts wrongly. We are far worse at recognizing the sin of the person who simply stands by, because doing nothing rarely feels like a decision at all. It feels like neutrality, like keeping the peace, like not making a fuss. But there are moments when standing by is itself the betrayal, when silence is not neutral at all, but is in fact the loudest possible answer, and this was one of them. The man was not neutral in that garden. He was absent while present, which is somehow worse than being absent, because he had every capacity to intervene and simply declined to use it. Neutrality in the moment that actually counts is not a way of avoiding the choice. It is a way of making the worst one while pretending you made none. And this particular failure has aged remarkably well, which is a polite way of saying it is absolutely everywhere. The sin of the bystander is arguably more common now than it has ever been, precisely because our age has made looking away so easy and so respectable. There is always a screen to glance down at, always a reason it is not really your business, always the comforting sense that surely someone else, more qualified and less busy than you, will step in and handle it. We have quietly elevated not getting involved into something that can almost pass for a virtue, a tidy sort of minding your own affairs. But the garden gently insists that there are moments when looking away is not minding your business at all, but abandoning your post. The times a single word from you might have stopped something and you chose the easier silence. The situations you could plainly see going wrong and decided, for the sake of a quiet life, that it was somebody else's problem to solve. None of that tends to feel like a decision, which is exactly what makes it so quietly dangerous. The first bridegroom, if he were honest, would tell you he never actually chose the fall. He simply stood there and let it happen, which turned out to be precisely the same thing wearing a far more comfortable face. But the passivity is only the first half of the man's story in that scene. The second half arrives right after the fall, and it is, if anything, even more revealing, because it shows you what the newly broken human heart reaches for first. When the two of them are finally confronted about what they have done, watch what happens, because it is one of the oldest and most familiar dances in the world. The man is asked plainly whether he ate from the tree, and instead of a simple yes, instead of owning it, he does something remarkable. He points first at his wife, blaming her for handing him the fruit, and then, in the very same breath, he manages to point at God as well, because notice how he phrases it. It was the woman you gave me. You gave me. In a single sentence, under mild questioning, the first man throws both his wife and his creator under the cart, implying that the whole disaster is really the fault of whoever arranged this unfortunate marriage in the first place. It is a masterclass in deflection, delivered by someone who had been a fallen creature for approximately 5 minutes and had apparently already achieved expert level. And then the blame simply keeps rolling. The woman, questioned in turn, does the exact same thing. She does not own it either. She points downstream at the serpent, insisting that she was deceived, that the real culprit is the creature who started the whole thing. And the serpent, one assumes, had no one left beneath him to point at, which is presumably the only reason the chain of blame finally stopped, having quite literally run out of anyone lower to accuse. And this is the thing to see clearly, because it reveals something permanent about what went wrong in us. The very first thing the fall produced was not violence, not theft, not any of the dramatic crimes we associate with a broken world. It was an excuse. The immediate, reflexive, instinctive fruit of the fall was the refusal to say the two hardest words a human being can say, which are, "It was me." Everyone in that garden had a finger extended, and every finger was pointed firmly away from its owner. There is a strange law that governs blame, and you can watch it operating in that scene as clearly as anywhere. Blame rolls downhill. It always rolls downhill. It looks for someone further down the slope, someone with less power, someone standing between you and the bottom, and it comes to rest on them. What it never, ever does on its own is roll uphill, back toward the self, back toward the one actually holding the responsibility. Nobody in that garden pointed at their own chest. The man pointed sideways and up, at his wife and at God. The woman pointed down, at the serpent. Every finger traveled in whatever direction led away from the one attached to it, which is precisely how blame behaves in every kitchen, every office, every family argument you have ever witnessed or, if we are being honest, participated in. The instinct to find someone else to carry it is not a modern character flaw. It is old. It is original. It was installed, so to speak, on day one. And it is worth noticing what blame actually accomplishes, which is, on close inspection, almost nothing useful whatsoever. When the man pointed at his wife, the fruit was still eaten. When the woman pointed at the serpent, the damage was still done. Not one finger, extended in any direction at all, undid a single thing that had happened. Blame does not repair the broken thing, It does not turn back the clock or restore what was lost. All it ever does is relocate the pain, shoving it off your own shoulders and onto someone else's, which feels, for one brief and cowardly moment, like relief. That is the entire appeal of it, and the entire lie of it. It is a way of feeling lighter without actually being one bit less responsible, of buying yourself a moment of comfort with somebody else's reputation. And because it fixes precisely nothing, it has to be repeated endlessly, which is why a household or a heart that runs on blame never actually resolves anything at all. It just keeps passing the same hot coal around the circle, everyone flinching as it reaches them, no one willing to close their hand around it and simply hold it until it cools. The refusal to say it was me does not make the mess any smaller. It only guarantees that the mess never gets cleaned up by anyone. Now hold that whole miserable picture in your mind, the silent bridegroom, the extended fingers, the guilt sliding downhill looking for the lowest place to land, and set beside it the figure the whole story has been quietly building toward, because he does the exact opposite at every single point, and the contrast is the entire message. There is, in this story, a true bridegroom, one whose bride is not a single woman in a garden, but a whole people. And everything the first bridegroom failed to do, this one does. Where the first stood silent, the true one speaks. Where the first stayed passive, the true one steps forward. Where the first hid behind his bride and let the danger reach her, the true one puts himself directly between his bride and everything that threatens her, and takes the full weight of it onto his own body so that it never reaches her at all. It is the precise inversion of the garden, the bridegroom finally standing where a bridegroom was always supposed to stand, which is in front, in the gap, in the path of the blow. It helps to understand why this whole story keeps reaching for the language of a wedding to describe a bond so much larger than any single marriage. All through these old writings, the relationship between God and his people gets painted, over and over, as a covenant shaped like a marriage, a committed, faithful, protective love rather than a distant arrangement between a ruler and his subjects. And within that picture, the role of the bridegroom is not mainly about ceremony or status or who gets top billing. It is about standing in the gap. It is about being the one who faces outward toward the danger so that the one behind him does not have to. The gap is the entire job. It is the space between the beloved and the thing that would harm her. And the bridegroom's whole calling is to fill that space with his own body if that is what the moment demands. The first one, handed exactly that role, left the gap standing wide open and let the danger walk straight through it to reach his bride. The true one, faced with the same gap and a threat immeasurably worse, walked into it on purpose and let the entire weight of the danger land on himself instead. Same role, same gap. Two utterly opposite ways of filling it, and the distance between them is the distance between a story that ends in ruin and one that ends in rescue. And when you come to the moment where he takes that blow, watch what he does with the blame, because it is the reversal of everything we just traced. He deflects absolutely nothing. There is not a single finger pointed away from himself in the entire scene. The old writings put it as plainly as it can be put, that he himself carried our wrongs in his own body, up onto the wood. First letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 24. He himself, in his own body. He does not say it was the woman or the serpent or the circumstances or the ones driving the nails. He does the unthinkable thing, the thing no one in that first garden could bring themselves to do. He points at his own chest, lay it on me, put it here. And then, as if that were not already the complete opposite of the garden, he goes one impossible step further. While the whole thing is being done to him, in the middle of it, he actually asks that the ones responsible be forgiven, on the grounds that they do not really understand what they are doing. Luke chapter 23, verse 34. The first man, questioned gently, could not even take responsibility for his own single act. The true bridegroom, while being killed, takes responsibility for everyone else's. There is a quiet outrage buried in that scene that we should not rush past, because it is exactly what makes the whole thing mean anything at all. In an ordinary courtroom, the entire point is that the guilty party carries the guilty verdict. That is simply what justice is supposed to look like, the weight landing squarely on the one who actually earned it. What happens here runs precisely backward. The one finger that finally turns and points inward, that finally says, "Put it on me," belongs to the single person in the entire story with absolutely nothing to confess. He was not carrying his own fault because he had none to carry. He was reaching out and gathering up everyone else's instead, the woman's and the man's and the whole miserable harvest of it, and deliberately pulling it onto shoulders that had earned none of it. Every other finger in the story had been busy shoving guilt away from the guilty. His did the exact opposite, dragging guilt toward the innocent on purpose by free choice. And that is the strange, upside-down heart of the entire thing. The problem in the garden was that no guilty party would take responsibility for what they had done. The answer, as it turns out, was not a guilty party finally owning up at last, but an innocent one voluntarily stepping in to carry what the guilty never could. That is not how any human court has ever worked, and it is precisely why it lands with such force. And there is the whole thing, and it collapses into a single line sharp enough to carry with you for the rest of your life. The first man sinned, and he pointed at his wife. The woman sinned, and she pointed at the serpent. The true one did not sin at all, and he pointed at himself. Every other finger in the entire story points away from its owner, hunting downhill for someone else to carry the weight. His is the only finger that turns around and points home, at the one person in the whole account who had done nothing whatsoever to deserve what he was about to carry. That reversal, the finger finally pointing at the self rather than away from it, is the difference between the disease and the cure, drawn in a single gesture. Let that show you what the real thing actually looks like, because we get it so badly confused. We tend to imagine that strength looks like never being at fault, like always having someone else to blame, like keeping your own record spotless by making sure the mess always ends up on somebody else's side of the line. That is not strength. That is the silent bridegroom in the garden, and it is the oldest weakness there is, dressed up as self-protection. The genuine article, the real strength and the real love, looks like exactly the opposite. It looks like stepping into the gap. It looks like carrying weight that was never fairly yours to carry rather than shoving weight that clearly is yours onto someone weaker. It looks like the willingness to say it was me even when a dozen easier exits stand wide open. Love in the story is not measured by how skillfully you avoid the blame. It is measured by how much of it you are willing to pick up and carry on behalf of someone who could never have carried it themselves. And that willingness to take the weight rather than pass it along turns out to be a small clue to something enormous, a hint of a much bigger reversal humming underneath the entire story, one we are now finally ready to see. Because if the true bridegroom flipped the direction of the blame, refusing to send it downhill and instead carrying it up onto himself, then it is worth asking whether that same flipping, that same turning of the whole thing on its head might be running much deeper through this story than one moment on a hill. It is, and it changes everything, and to see it, we only have to ask one simple question that almost nobody thinks to ask. Here is the question. In each of these two great confrontations, the one in the garden and the one in the wilderness, who actually started it, who made the first move, who chose the ground? It sounds almost too basic to bother with. The kind of question you skip because you assume you already know the answer, and that is exactly why it has been hiding in plain sight this whole time. Go back to the garden, and the answer seems obvious, because there it is genuinely the enemy who initiates. He is the one who comes slithering into the scene. He picks the moment, waiting until conditions suit him. He picks the target, going after the one he judges most reachable. He picks the ground, the terms, the opening line. He is, in every sense, the aggressor, the predator on the move, the hunter who has spotted his quarry and closed the distance on his own initiative. Nobody invited him, nobody arranged for him to be there. He came hunting entirely of his own accord, and the whole tragedy unfolds from his opening move. So far, so straightforward. The enemy is the one who starts it. Now go to the wilderness and ask the very same question, and here is where the ground quietly drops out from under you. Who brought the man to the desert? Who set that scene in motion? And the answer is not the enemy at all. The man did not wander out there by chance and get ambushed. He was led by the Spirit deliberately into that exact place. And one of the accounts uses a word for it that is far stronger and stranger than our gentle led, a word most translations quietly soften because its full force is a little shocking. The original term is one that means to drive out, to thrust out, to cast forcibly, and it is, of all things, the exact same word the same writer uses elsewhere for casting out demons. Mark chapter 1, verse 12. The Spirit did not politely suggest a retreat in the desert. The Spirit drove him out into it, propelled him there with real force, straight toward the waiting enemy. Which means that in the wilderness, the roles from the garden are completely inverted. God is the one who set the conditions. God chose the battlefield. God picked the timing, and God personally delivered the opponent onto the field. This was not the enemy's ambush that heaven happened to permit. It was heaven's arena, and the enemy was the one brought into it. And that inversion is worth pausing on because of what it quietly says about the whole posture of the thing. In the garden, the good side is on defense. The enemy moves first, the enemy chooses everything, and the tragedy is essentially the story of a successful attack that nobody repelled. But in the wilderness, for the very first time, the good side is on offense. God is no longer reacting to a threat that came slithering in uninvited. God is the one making the opening move, choosing the ground, setting the terms, and summoning the opponent to a field of his own choosing. The enemy, who had spent the entire story as the aggressor, the one forever initiating, suddenly finds himself in the deeply unfamiliar position of the one who has been called out, the defendant rather than the prosecutor, the summoned rather than the summoner. And he does not appear to notice the shift at all, which is a large part of what makes it so devastating. He struts onto the field, still fully believing he is the one who chose to be there, still convinced he is the hunter closing on his kill, with no apparent awareness that he has been drawn out into the open by an initiative that was never once his own. The creature who had always moved first had, for the first time in the whole long story, been quietly beaten to the first move. And once that lands, the entire scene reorganizes itself around a piece of dramatic irony so complete it is almost breathtaking. Picture the enemy's point of view for a moment. He looks at the situation and sees, as far as he's concerned, the softest target imaginable. A man alone, a man starving at the absolute floor of his strength, 40 days without food. No crowd around him, no visible protection, no army of angels standing guard, nothing. From where the enemy stands, this is easy money, a wounded animal separated from the herd, the ideal conditions to move in and finish the job. He thinks he is the hunter. He thinks he has stumbled onto helpless prey in an unguarded moment. What he cannot see, because it is the one thing he is constitutionally incapable of imagining, is that he is not the hunter at all. He has been drawn deliberately onto a field chosen by someone else, to walk into a trap he does not even know is a trap. And every step he takes toward the seemingly easy kill is a step deeper into the jaws of something he entirely failed to notice closing around him. And this same devastating pattern, the enemy mistaking the trap for the prize, is not a one-time trick. It is the signature of the whole conflict, and it reaches its absolute peak much later, at the very moment the enemy is most certain he has finally won. There is a striking line about this, written by someone reflecting back on the whole thing, and it says that none of the rulers of this present age understood what was really happening, because if they had understood it, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. First letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 8. Read that slowly because of what it quietly admits. The enemy's single greatest apparent victory, the moment he surely believed was his crowning triumph, the killing of the very one who had come to undo him, was in fact the exact instrument of his own undoing. He thought the cross was the trap closing on his enemy. It was the trap closing on him. If he had had the faintest idea what he was actually doing, he would never have gone through with it, which is precisely why it was allowed to look, right up until the final second, like a win. There is a piece of that line worth turning over slowly, the part about the rulers of the age failing to understand, because it reveals something crucial about how the whole thing had to work. The plan could only succeed if it stayed completely hidden from the very one it was designed to defeat. Had the enemy grasped what that final confrontation actually was, what it would actually accomplish, he would never in 1,000 years have gone anywhere near it. He would have done everything in his considerable power to prevent it, to keep his supposed victim comfortable and unharmed and as far from that outcome as possible. The entire strategy depended on his confidence, on his absolute certainty that he was winning, because that very certainty was the thing that led him to strike the blow that undid him. His arrogance was not some incidental side detail, it was load-bearing. He was permitted, even quietly encouraged, to believe he was triumphing, precisely so that he would commit himself fully to the single act that guaranteed his own defeat. It is the oldest move in all of strategy, letting your opponent believe the open door is a golden opportunity when it is in fact the mouth of the trap. And here it is carried out on a scale that genuinely takes the breath away, with the cleverest adversary that has ever existed marching through that door, positively beaming with confidence. So gather it all into the irony it really is, because it runs through the whole story from beginning to end. Every single time the enemy was certain he was winning, he was in fact being outplayed. Every apparent triumph turned out, on closer inspection, to be a step deeper into a trap laid long before he arrived. The hunter, so proud of his stalking, became the prey without ever realizing the roles had switched. The one who prided himself on setting the perfect snare walked directly into a far better one, and congratulated himself the whole way in. He was, from the beginning, playing a game whose rules he did not understand against an opponent he did not know was even at the table. And he mistook his own steady march into defeat for a series of clever victories. There is something almost pitiable in it, this endless confidence of a creature who cannot conceive that the board itself belongs to the other side. And it is important to be clear that none of this was a lucky accident, some happy turn the story merely stumbled into after the fact. We touched earlier on the strange way the enemy's own hostility keeps getting turned against his own aims, his attack somehow manufacturing the very thing he was straining to prevent. What this reversal finally reveals is that this was never a fortunate coincidence at all. It was the design. The enemy was not an unstoppable force that God cleverly managed to work around once the damage was done. He was, from the very beginning, a piece being moved on a board he could not see, his every apparent initiative quietly folded into a plan, authored from somewhere far above his line of sight. That is a very different picture from the one most people carry around, in which good and evil are two roughly matched powers slugging it out with the outcome genuinely hanging in the balance. This story insists on something else entirely. There was never a real contest for control. There was only a creature convinced he was a rival, playing out a scripted role in a drama whose ending had been settled before he ever spoke his first word, mistaking his own small part for a war he imagined he was winning. And here is where all of this reaches out of the ancient story and touches your own life directly in a way that might quietly rearrange how you understand your own hardest seasons. If the desert was not really the enemy's ambush, but heaven's arena, if the man out there among the rocks was not actually cornered prey, but the deliberately chosen champion delivered onto a field where the outcome was already secured, then it is worth asking a genuinely unsettling question about your own wildernesses. In those stripped-down, painful, isolated stretches you have walked through, the ones that felt exactly like being hunted, like being cornered and ambushed and left alone to be picked apart, is it possible you had the roles exactly backward the whole time? Is it possible that you were never really the helpless victim of that hard place at all, but something much closer to the prize being fought over on a field you did not choose? Brought there not to be destroyed, but to have something in you finally revealed and proven and won. It does not make the desert any less dry while you are standing in it. But it changes, rather dramatically, the question of who was really cornered and whose trap was actually closing, and it changes it in a direction almost nobody dares to hope for from inside the dust. And that great reversal, the one that turned the hunter into the hunted and the hardest place into the chosen field, is not quite finished playing out yet. It has one more scene left to run in one final garden, where the whole long arc that first began among the trees comes curving back around to a tree one last time, and where the very choice the first man got so catastrophically wrong is finally, deliberately and completely made right. 2 men, 2 gardens, 2 decisions pointing in exactly opposite directions, and everything hanging on the difference. That is exactly where we're going now. So follow him out of the city, in the dark, up a hillside to a quiet grove of olive trees. The night is cold, the friends who came along have already drifted off to sleep, and the man is on his knees among the roots and the shadows, in more distress than at any point in the whole story so far. And here is the detail that almost every retelling of this story quietly skips, the piece that turns out to be the hidden key to the entire thing. This is a garden. The place is a garden. The story that began in a garden went out into a wilderness and has been circling back toward its origin the whole time, arrives at last in another garden, and everything that has been building for the entire account comes to its point right here among the olive trees, in the dark, with a man on his knees. Most people who know this story at all tend to hold two locations in their minds: the garden where it all went wrong at the start, and the hill where it was all put right at the end, and they draw a straight line between the two. But that skips the pivot, the hinge, the place where the decisive thing actually happened, and that place is this quiet grove. The hill was where the price was paid, but this garden is where the choice to pay it was finally, irrevocably made. Executions do not decide anything. They carry out a decision made somewhere else, earlier, in private. And the real decision, the one everything else hung on, was made here in the dark among the roots, hours before a single nail was involved. Which is exactly why this middle garden, so often treated as a brief emotional interlude on the way to the main event, is in fact the true climax of the entire story. The main event was not the dying, it was the yes that made the dying possible, and the yes was spoken here. Think back to the first garden and what a man did there. He reached, he stretched out his hand and grasped for the one thing not offered to him, seizing the right to decide for himself, snatching at a life run on his own terms. Underneath that reach, though nobody said it aloud, was a single unspoken sentence, the quiet creed of the whole fall. Not your will, but mine. That was the thing being chosen when the hand closed around the fruit. My judgment over yours, my terms over yours. My will, please, and not yours. Now listen to what the man in the second garden actually prays, because it is the exact sentence from the first garden, turned completely around and spoken in reverse. Kneeling there in the dark, facing something so heavy that the prayer is wrung out of him under real anguish, he asks that if there is any possible way, this cup might be taken from him. And then he adds the line that undoes everything the first garden did: not my will, but yours be done. Luke chapter 22, verse 42, echoed in Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. Sit with how precisely that mirrors the first garden and inverts it. In the first, a man reached out to grasp, and the whole disaster followed from a heart that said, in effect, my will over yours. In the second, a man opens his hands and lets go, and the whole rescue follows from a heart that says the opposite, your will over mine. In the first garden, a man in a garden grasps. In the second garden, a man in a garden surrenders. The identical setting, the identical stakes, and the exact opposite gesture, the closed fist finally opened. It is worth understanding what that cup he asked to have removed actually was, because the image is not random. All through the older writings, a cup is a picture of a portion assigned to you, the specific measure of something poured out for you to drink. And very often what fills it is not wine but suffering, the full share of a hard thing handed to a particular person to bear. So when he asks whether this cup might pass, he is not flinching at some vague unpleasantness. He is looking directly at a specific, filled, and terrible portion that has his name on it, understanding exactly what drinking it will involve, and asking with complete honesty whether there is any conceivable way around it. That honesty matters because it means the surrender was not the surrender of someone who did not grasp what was being asked. He saw the cup clearly, all the way to the bottom of it. He knew precisely what was in it, and knowing in full what the portion contained, he still, at the end of the struggle, reached out and took it, not because he wanted it, but because he wanted his Father's will more than he wanted the way out. A person who drinks a bitter cup without understanding it is merely unlucky. A person who drinks it with his eyes fully open is doing something else entirely. And this is the moment, if you have been holding on to it as I asked you to a while back, when that quiet little pairing of over and under finally comes home, and in a form you almost certainly did not see coming. We said that the whole hidden battle, underneath every temptation, was a matter of whether a person would climb over the word set in front of them and start editing it, or place themselves beneath it and let it hold them. Watch what this prayer actually is. It is a man placing himself under, not merely under a written line this time, but under the entire will of the Father, under the whole weight of it, in the single hardest moment imaginable, when every instinct in him is straining toward another way out. The first garden was the ultimate act of standing over, a creature climbing above the will of God to install his own. This second garden is the ultimate act of standing under, the true son placing his own will, fully and deliberately, beneath his father's, precisely when it cost him everything to do it. The whole story really did come down to over and under, and here is where the under is chosen at the very bottom of the very worst night, and chosen freely. And notice what is actually being turned down in that prayer, because it is the same thing that was turned down out in the wilderness, only now arriving in its final and heaviest form. Long ago, among the desert rocks, we watched the offer of a shortcut, the promise of the crown without the long and terrible road that led to it. That was the rehearsal. This is the performance. Here in the garden, the shortcut is still agonizingly on the table. The cup could be set aside, the suffering could be refused. There was, right up to the final second, a version of events in which he simply did not go through with it, in which the crown was somehow claimed without the thorns after all. That door never fully closed until he closed it himself, here, on his knees, with the words, "Not my will, but yours." This was the last and hardest no to the oldest and most attractive lie, the definitive refusal of the easy path, made not in the flush of full strength, but at the absolute limit of what a person can bear. And it is worth being honest about how hard that no actually was, because we have a bad habit of imagining it came easily, delivered with serene composure, as though a divine son would naturally breeze through it without breaking a sweat. The account refuses to let us picture it that way. The struggle in that garden was real, real enough that the text describes him in genuine anguish, sweating and pleading, asking 3 separate times whether there might be some other route. This was not a calm formality, it was a fight, the hardest fight in the whole story, harder by far than the desert, because the full cost was now fully visible and pressing in from every side. And that is exactly what makes the yes mean something. A surrender that costs nothing is not really surrender, it is just going along. The yes in that garden cost him everything, and he could see the whole bill itemized in advance, and he said it anyway, which is the entire difference between a hollow gesture and the realest choice ever made. And it is worth being equally clear that nobody made him do it. This is the piece that keeps the whole thing from being a tragedy of someone trapped by fate. He was not cornered, not out of options, not dragged toward the outcome by a force he could not resist. The entire weight of the scene rests on the fact that the choice was genuinely open, that another way really was available right up until he closed the door on it himself. A surrender that is forced is not surrender at all, it is just defeat wearing a nobler face. What happened in that garden was the opposite of defeat. It was the freest act imaginable, a choice made by someone who could plainly have chosen otherwise and knew it, which is precisely what gives it its staggering weight. The value of a yes is measured entirely by how real the no was, and here the no was as real and as reachable as it could possibly be. He did not fall into obedience because he ran out of alternatives. He walked into it with his eyes open, past a wide and inviting exit, on purpose. And there is one more quiet echo in the scene, easy to miss, that mirrors the very first garden and turns it inside out. Back at the start, we noticed a man who was present, standing right there with his companion in the decisive moment, and who failed anyway, silent and passive when everything was at stake. Look at the arrangement here and notice it is the reverse. The companions who came along to this garden are not standing at his side in the crucial hour. They are asleep, some distance off, useless to him exactly when he most needs someone awake. He faces the hardest decision of the entire story with no human support whatsoever, entirely alone among the trees, and he does not fail. The first man had company and folded. The true one had no one and held. Even the staging of the 2 gardens is quietly arguing that the difference between them was never really about the circumstances. And now look up from the kneeling figure and notice the trees, because the story has been quietly obsessed with trees from the very first page, and here the pattern completes itself. It all began at a tree where a hand reached up and grasped a fruit, and death came into the world through that grasping. And it all resolves at another piece of wood entirely, because the cross he was about to be nailed to is, remarkably, called a tree in the old writings, directly and more than once, described as the tree upon which he was hung. Acts chapter 5, verse 30, and again in the letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 13. So set the 2 trees side by side. At the first tree, a man reached out and took, and grasping brought death. At the second tree, a man was stretched out and gave, and the giving brought life. One tree, death through the closing of a hand around something forbidden. The other tree, life through the opening of two hands to receive nails. The whole tragedy of the reaching hand answered at last by the mercy of the open one. And here is why the garden setting matters so much, why it is not merely a nice piece of scenery. The undoing of the first garden had to happen in a garden. The reversal gets sealed in exactly the same kind of place where the whole thing first came apart, as though the story were insisting on returning to the scene of the original wound in order to heal it there rather than somewhere else. What broke in a garden is set right in a garden. The wrong turn taken among the trees is turned back around among the trees. It is the tidiest, most deliberate bookend imaginable, and it means that the struggle out in the wilderness, dramatic as it was never quite the final word. The wilderness was the training ground, the rehearsal where the levers were faced and beaten one by one. The garden is where the real and final yes was spoken, the deepest surrender of all, the whole thing brought back to its beginning and mended at the root, which leaves us with a single sentence that the entire story has been driving toward from the opening frame, and it is this: the disobedience of one man in a garden is undone by the obedience of one man in a garden. One reached and took, and it broke the world. One knelt and surrendered, and it began putting the world back together. And that idea that the whole catastrophe gets reversed by one person retracing the path and getting right everything the first got wrong turns out to have a name, and a very old one. But before we give that reversal its proper name, we have to go back one final time to the scene of the original break, because the promise that all of this would happen was made right there, in the wreckage, shockingly early, long before anyone in that garden could possibly have expected a word of hope. Go back, then, to the immediate aftermath of the first garden, to the scene the moment after the fruit was eaten, while the guilty pair are still standing there and the full consequences have not even finished being spelled out. You would expect at that moment nothing but a sentence, a verdict, the cold reading out of the punishment. And there is judgment, to be sure, but tucked directly into the middle of it, spoken before the humans have even been sent away, comes something nobody in that garden could have seen coming. God turns and addresses the serpent directly, and what he says is not merely a curse. It is a promise, the very first promise of rescue in the entire story. And it is astonishing both for what it says and for how early it arrives. He announces that from the woman will come a descendant, an offspring, who will one day crush the serpent's head, while the serpent will manage only to strike that descendant's heel. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. That single sentence is sometimes called the first gospel, the earliest piece of good news anywhere in the whole library, and it was delivered while the wreckage of the fall was, so to speak, still warm. Two things about that promise are worth pausing on because they are so easy to rush straight past. The first is who it was actually addressed to. God did not turn first to comfort the frightened, cowering humans. He turned to the enemy, and the opening move of the entire rescue was, of all things, a sentence pronounced over the head of the one who had just seemed to win everything, announcing his eventual defeat to his face. Grace entered the world at the very first in the form of a verdict against evil, spoken directly at the thing that had done the damage. The second is the shape of the injury each side was promised. A blow to the heel is painful, even serious, but survivable, the sort of wound you limp away from. A blow to the head is fatal, final, the end of the matter. So the promise quietly encoded the entire outcome from the very beginning. The rescuer would be struck, genuinely and painfully, wounded in the doing of it. But the enemy would be finished. The serpent would land one real hit and lose the whole war in the same motion, which, if you have been following the long pattern of a hunter who kept mistaking his own undoing for a triumph, ought to sound extremely familiar by now. The end was named at the very beginning, and the one it was named against never once saw it coming. And the thinkers of the centuries that followed gave that whole grand reversal a name. The name goes back a very long way to a thinker named Irenaeus of Lyons, writing back in the 2nd century, who put words to something the story had been doing all along. He called it recapitulation, which is a heavy word for a beautifully simple idea. The idea is that Christ deliberately re-walks the entire path of the first man step by step, and at each point where the first one went wrong, does the opposite and turns it right. Where the first was tested and failed, the second is tested and stands. Where the first grasped, the second gives. Where the first said my will, the second says yours. The whole broken sequence gets played again in reverse, by someone who refuses at every turn to make the old mistake, until the entire thing has been unwound. Obedience, undoing disobedience, all the way down the line. The letters that came later put it in exactly these terms, that through one man's disobedience many were made sinners, and through one man's obedience many are made right, and that just as in the first man all die, so in this last one all are made alive. The letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 19, and the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, at verses 22 and 45, where he is called memorably the last Adam, the final and true version of the first, come back to do it properly. That phrase, the last Adam, is worth turning over because it quietly reframes the whole of human history as the tale of two men rather than billions. In this way of seeing it, everyone who has ever lived is standing behind one of two figures, sharing in what that figure did. Behind the first stands a whole humanity that inherited his reach, his grasping, his broken trust, and his death, simply by being human without ever having to sign up for it. And behind the last stands the offer of a different inheritance entirely, a share in his obedience, his surrender, and his life, extended to anyone willing to step out from behind the first man and stand behind the second instead. It is not that we are each running our own isolated race and being scored individually. It is that we are each, whether we realize it or not, represented by one of two people, receiving what they earned as though we had earned it ourselves. The first man handed his whole line a debt none of them ran up personally. The last man offers his whole line a wealth none of them could ever have accumulated. And the entire question in the end comes down to which of the two you are content to let stand in for you. And once you're looking through that lens, that the whole rescue is the careful undoing of the whole fall, you start noticing that the very first garden was quietly seeded with hints of the ending, planted right there in the wreckage of the beginning, little foreshadowings hiding in plain sight the whole time. Two of them are worth pulling out because they are astonishing once you see them, and easy to walk straight past if you do not. The first hint comes at the moment you would least expect any kindness at all. The fall has just happened. The guilty pair have tried to cover their own shame with a hasty stitching together of fig leaves, which is about as effective as it sounds, roughly the spiritual equivalent of hiding a house fire behind a curtain. And into that scene, God does something strangely tender and strangely ominous at the same time. He makes them proper coverings, garments of skin, and clothes them with his own hand. Genesis chapter 3, verse 21. But stop and think about where garments of skin come from. Something had to die to make them. In order to cover the two who had failed, a life was taken, blood was shed, and the very first death in the entire story turns out to be not a punishment inflicted on the guilty, but a covering provided for them at the cost of another. The humans tried to cover themselves and could not, so a covering was made for them, and it cost a life. If that faintly echoes something you now know is coming much later, that is precisely the point. It was the first quiet sketch of the whole idea, that the guilty would one day be covered, not by their own frantic efforts, but by a life laid down on their behalf. And do not miss the contrast between the two coverings in that scene, because it is doing quiet work. The humans tried first to cover their own shame, and what they reached for were fig leaves, stitched together in a hurry. It is worth appreciating just how inadequate that is as a solution, because it is a perfect little picture of every self-covering attempt that has ever followed. Leaves wilt, they dry out, curl up, and fall apart within a day or two, which means the first pair had chosen a covering with a shelf life of roughly one afternoon, requiring constant frantic replacement forever after. That is exactly what all our own attempts to cover ourselves look like from a little distance. The endless, exhausting project of stitching together our achievements and our excuses and our carefully managed reputations into something that might hide the thing underneath, and finding that it keeps wilting and needing to be redone. The covering the humans made for themselves could not last. The covering that was made for them at the cost of a life could. And the whole difference between the two is the difference between trying to manufacture your own worth, which we already saw as exhausting and endless, and simply receiving a covering provided by someone else, which is the only kind that ever actually holds. The second hint comes a few lines later, and at first it reads as pure bad news. Once the humans are sent out, the way back into the garden, back to the tree of life at its heart, is sealed off, guarded by fearsome angelic figures wielding a flaming sword that turns every direction. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. The door home is shut, and it is shut with a blade. That is judgment, plain and stern, the way back to life barred by angels with a weapon. Now hold that image, angels with a sword blocking the way, and set beside it a small line from the very end of the wilderness ordeal we have spent so long on. When it is all over, when the desert has been endured and the enemy has withdrawn, the account notes, almost in passing, that angels came and served him. Matthew chapter 4, verse 11. Look at what has happened to the angels between those two scenes. In the first garden, angels stand guard with a drawn sword, barring the way, keeping the human out. In the wilderness, angels come near to a man and minister to him, tending and serving. The very beings who once enforced the exile have become the ones who wait on the true Son. That shift from angels with swords keeping us out to angels with open hands drawing near is the entire message of the story compressed into a single change of posture. Judgment turning into service, the guarded door starting to open. And there is a further quiet logic to that flaming sword worth drawing out, because a sword raised in judgment does not simply vanish on its own when the mood improves. A drawn blade has to come down somewhere before the way it guards can be reopened. For the sword barring the path back to life to be lowered, the judgment it represented could not just be waved away and forgotten as though the fall had never mattered. It had to fall. The whole tension of the story sits right there, in a door sealed by a blade that cannot simply be sheathed without the thing it stands for being dealt with. And the resolution the story eventually offers is not that the sword was quietly put away and everyone agreed to move on. It is that the blow the sword represented finally landed, not on the humans it had been holding back, but on the true Son who stepped deliberately into its path, the same way he had stepped into every other gap. The way home did not open because the judgment was canceled. It opened because the judgment was absorbed, taken by someone standing in the place of the ones it had been aimed at, which is why the angels at the end have no need of swords at all. There was nothing left for the blade to do. And it does open all the way at the very last page of the whole library, which closes the circle so perfectly it is hard to believe it was not planned from the start, which of course is rather the point. The tree of life, the one sealed away behind the flaming sword at the beginning, the one humanity was cut off from and sent away from, shows up again right at the end. It stands by a river growing on both banks of it, and its leaves, the text says, are for the healing of the nations. Revelation chapter 22, verse 2. The tree that was locked away is unlocked. The access that was severed is restored. The story that opened with a door slammed shut on the tree of life ends with that very tree standing wide open and freely available, its leaves spread out to heal everything that the long story in between had broken. It ends exactly where it began, at the tree of life, but with the sword gone and the way thrown open. And notice that it does not merely return to the beginning as if the whole long, painful story in between had simply been erased and everyone put back where they started, none the wiser. The ending is not a reset. It is more than the beginning. At the start, there was a single garden with 2 people in it. At the end, there is a whole city with a river running through it and nations streaming toward the tree, its leaves spread wide for the healing of entire peoples, rather than the private enjoyment of one couple. The tree that once stood in the middle of a small garden now grows on both banks of a river, at the center of a city full of the healed. Whatever was lost was not merely recovered, it was recovered and expanded. The private paradise opened out into something vast and shared, which is its own quiet answer to the oldest fear about all of this, the worry that redemption is just a return to square one, a wiping of the slate that leaves you exactly as unremarkable as before. The story insists on the opposite. The end is not the beginning again. It is the beginning grown up, healed, thrown open, and made larger than it ever was before the whole thing broke. So let the whole thing gather into one final image, the one this entire account has been quietly assembling from the very first frame. At the beginning, a man was offered a living tree and reached out to take from it on his own terms, and his grasping handed the world over to death. At the end, a man was offered a dead tree, a bare cross of execution, And instead of grasping, he opened his hands and let himself be given to it, and his surrender handed the world back its life. One reached for the tree of life and found death. One embraced the tree of death and found life. The first closed his hand around something to seize it. The last opened his hands to give himself away. And between those two gestures, the reach and the release, lies the whole distance between the world we broke and the world being made new. If you take nothing else away from this whole long journey through the gardens and the wilderness, take that single contrast, because everything else has been an unfolding of it. 2 men, 2 gardens, 2 trees, and underneath them all, one small and endlessly repeated choice, the choice of the hand. One hand closed, reaching to seize and to keep and to run its own life on its own terms, and it brought death. One hand opened, releasing, surrendering, receiving whatever the Father gave, even nails, and it brought life. Every temptation we took apart along the way, the body and the eyes and the self, was only ever a variation on the same question aimed at the same hand. Will you grasp or will you receive? Will you climb over or will you rest under? Will you close your fist around a life you can control or open it to a life you cannot earn? The entire story, from the first tree to the last, turns on that one small motion of the fingers. Which brings us finally to you, because this was never meant to end as a tidy piece of information to be filed away and admired from a safe distance. It ends as an invitation, which is a very different thing. The way back to the tree of life, the one that was sealed for so long behind a sword, does not stand open as a fact to be noted. It stands open as a door to be walked through. Every figure in this whole story faced in the end the same simple choice we have watched play out over and over. The choice between the closed fist and the open hand, between grasping to run your own life on your own terms and receiving a life you could never earn or manufacture for yourself. That same choice is quietly held out to you now, not as a demand hammered down on you, but as an open hand extended, the way a covering was once extended to 2 people who could not cover themselves. You do not have to climb over anything. You do not have to prove anything or manufacture your own worth or earn your own way back through the sword. The road home was reopened by someone else, at his own cost, and the only thing left to do with an open door is to walk through it. That is the whole invitation. It is not information, it is an open hand, held out, waiting. And if some part of you is already objecting that you are not the sort of person who could walk through that door, that you are too tired, too far gone, too tangled up in your own version of the reach for control to be welcome on the other side of it, then notice that the objection is simply the oldest lever running one more time. The whisper that your worth is something you have to establish before you are allowed anything good. An open hand does not require you to arrive strong. That is rather the entire point of it being an open hand rather than a set of hurdles. The 2 people who received the very first covering had just failed spectacularly and were hiding in the bushes when it was offered to them. They did not clean themselves up first or prove they deserved it or earn their way back into favor. They were covered exactly as they were, in the middle of the wreckage they had made, by a hand that reached toward them precisely because they could not reach far enough themselves. The invitation held out at the end of all this is the same kind of thing. It is not a reward for the strong. It is a covering for people who already know deep down that they cannot cover themselves, which, if we are honest, is every last one of us. And if this journey through the 2 gardens and the 1 wilderness has stirred something in you, if you found yourself seeing an old and familiar story with genuinely new eyes tonight, then do consider staying around for the next one, because there are more of these ancient patterns hiding in plain sight than we could ever hope to unpack in a single sitting. And the next thread is every bit as good as this one.